They told this story wrong. Every court historian, every trembling scribe who pressed quill to parchment under candlelight in Ravenscroft got it wrong. They wrote about a tyrant softened by a woman's touch, a beast tamed, a romantic fable wrapped in silk and served to children at bedtime. But the truth about Duke Cedric Vale was far uglier, far more human, and far more dangerous than any fairy tale ever dared to be. Because the night everything changed, the Duke of Blackthorn was not conquering kingdoms. He was standing alone in a frozen courtyard, watching a woman refuse to kneel and realizing for the first time in his miserable life that control was not the same thing as survival. If you think you know how this ends, you do not. Stay. Winter came to Ravenscroft the way death came to old men. Slowly at first, then all at once, burying the northern duchy under iron skies that pressed so low against the mountains you could almost reach up and crack them with your fist. The snow turned black 3 days before midwinter. Not gray, not dirty white. Black, as though the sky itself was bleeding ash. And the people in the villages below Blackthorn Castle stopped looking up because looking up meant acknowledging that something was wrong with the world. And they had learned, under Cedric Vale's rule, that acknowledging anything was wrong could get you killed. The Duke stood on the highest balcony of Blackthorn Castle at 4 a.m, bare hands gripping the stone railing, watching. Below, torchlight carved orange wounds through the darkness as soldiers dragged 3 prisoners across the courtyard. The chains made a sound like breaking teeth against the frozen cobblestones. 2 of the prisoners were merchants. The third was a minor lord whose name Cedric had already forgotten. They had been caught smuggling grain across the border into the neighboring province of Ashenmere, violating Ravenscroft's trade embargo, feeding enemy mouths with Ravenscroft wheat, while Ravenscroft's own villages rationed bread. Cedric did not feel anger. He had stopped feeling anger the way most men understood it years ago. What he felt instead was a cold, mechanical certainty that these 3 men had miscalculated. They had looked at the map, looked at the distance between their warehouses and the border, looked at the bribes they had paid to customs officers, and concluded that the Duke of Blackthorn would not notice. That was the miscalculation, not the crime itself. The assumption that he was not watching. He was always watching. "Bring them to the East Tower," he said without turning around. Behind him, Commander Renaud Theros stood in full military dress despite the hour, his breath freezing in the air between them. Theros had served Cedric for 11 years. He had watched the Duke grow from a traumatized 17-year-old boy into something the Empire's most seasoned generals refused to face on an open field. "Your Grace, Lord Ashford claims diplomatic protections under the King's Charter. His family has petitioned the Crown directly. Has the King responded?" "Not yet." "Then he has no protections." Theros hesitated. It was a small hesitation, the kind that lasted half a breath, but Cedric caught it the way a hawk catches the tremor of a rabbit beneath snow. He turned slowly. "Say it." "The court is arriving for midwinter, Your Grace. 300 nobles, ambassadors from 6 provinces. If Lord Ashford is seen in chains during the feast, it sends a message." "Good. It sends a message to the king." "Better?" Theros exhaled through his nose. He knew this rhythm. Every conversation with Cedric Vale followed the same architecture. You presented the political reality. He acknowledged it. Then he did exactly what he intended to do from the start, because political reality was something that happened to other people. "The prisoners will be processed before the feast begins," Cedric said. "Ashford's lands will be seized under wartime tariff violation. His family may petition whoever they wish. If the king objects, he can send an army." "Your Grace." "You are dismissed." Theros bowed and left. The door closed behind him with the muffled weight of oak against stone, and Cedric was alone again on the balcony with the black snow and the silence and the sound of chains below. He did not go back to bed. He had not slept through a full night since he was 14 years old, since the night he had hidden beneath burning beams in the west wing of this very castle, while assassins butchered his mother and 2 brothers during a coup orchestrated by his uncle. The fire had been set to cover the murders. Young Cedric had survived not because he was brave or clever or chosen by fate for something greater. He survived because a falling beam had pinned a dead servant's body across the crawlspace opening, and the killers assumed the screaming had stopped because everyone inside was dead. He had lain there for 6 hours, breathing smoke through wet cloth torn from the dead woman's dress, listening to his mother beg, listening to the begging stop. Some nights, when the castle was quiet enough and the wind came from the west, he could still hear it. He did not think about this, not consciously. He had trained himself over 2 decades to convert memory into fuel, trauma into architecture. Every brutal decision he made, every rival lord who vanished after a midnight audience, every merchant who paid double taxes to cross Ravencroft's borders was a brick in the wall between Caedric Vale and the boy who had screamed silently beneath a burning floor. And the wall worked. It had worked for 20 years. The duchy prospered under iron discipline. The armies of Ravencroft guarded the Empire's most dangerous northern frontier, and even King Aldrich tolerated Caedric's excesses because the alternative was facing the border wars alone. Ravencroft was necessary. Caedric made sure of that. Necessary men could not be destroyed. That was the theory. The Midwinter Court arrived over the next 3 days in a procession of carriages and armored escorts that stretched along the mountain road like a jeweled serpent. Noble families from across the duchy and beyond descended upon Blackthorn Castle, each one desperate to win the Duke's favor, each one terrified of catching his attention for the wrong reason. They brought gifts, they brought daughters, they brought smiles so carefully constructed you could see the stress fractures behind their teeth. Cedric received them in the Great Hall, seated on a throne carved from the same black stone as the castle itself, wearing military dress without decoration. No crown, no ceremonial robes. The absence of ornament was the ornament. It said, "I do not need symbols of power because I am the power." The nobles understood this language fluently. Lord Malrek Dernwood arrived first, bowing so deeply his forehead nearly touched the marble. He was the wealthiest landowner in the eastern provinces, a man whose family had held their territory for 9 generations, and he folded himself in half before Caedric Vale like a man apologizing for existing. "Your Grace, House Dernwood pledges its loyalty and its harvest to Ravencroft this winter." "Your harvest is already pledged by treaty, Lord Dernwood. You are not offering anything. You are reminding me that you have not yet broken your obligations." Dernwood's smile cracked at the edges but held. "Of course, Your Grace." Behind him, Duchess Vivienne Morcant entered without announcement, because Vivienne never waited for announcements. She was the widow of Caedric's older brother, Aldrin, who had died in a hunting accident 7 years earlier. She wore black velvet and rubies and moved through the hall with the proprietary ease of a woman who still considered Blackthorn Castle partially hers, which, in certain legal interpretations of the duchy's inheritance codes, it was. Caedric watched her approach with the flat attention of a man studying a chess piece that had not yet revealed its purpose. "Vivienne, Caedric, you look tired, and you look ambitious. Shall we skip the pleasantries? I brought a cask of Thornfield Red. Consider it a peace offering." "I do not drink peace offerings. I drink wine. Leave the cask with the steward." Vivienne smiled. It was a beautiful smile, technically, in the way that a well-made blade was beautiful. Sharp, polished, and designed to open things that were meant to stay closed. She took her seat at the high table without being invited, and Caedric let her, because removing her publicly would create a scene, and scenes were weapons that Vivienne wielded better than anyone in Ravencroft. The court filled over the next hours. Ministers and military commanders and minor lords and ladies all arranged in the Great Hall according to a hierarchy so complex that seating disputes had caused 3 duels and 1 assassination in the last decade alone. Candles blazed in iron chandeliers that hung from chains thick enough to anchor warships. The marble floor beneath them was stained by centuries of spilled wine and spilled blood, and nobody in the room pretended not to know the difference. Then she arrived. Lady Seraphina Ashcombe entered the Great Hall at precisely the wrong moment, when Caedric was mid-sentence delivering a verdict on a border taxation dispute, and every eye in the room was locked on the Duke's mouth, waiting for the word that would make or destroy the petitioner kneeling before him. The doors opened. Cold air knifed through the hall, and a woman in silver silk walked in without escort, without herald, without the trembling deference that every other guest had wrapped themselves in like armor. Cedric did not stop speaking. His mouth continued forming words about tariffs and penalties, while his eyes tracked her across the hall with the involuntary precision of a predator registering movement in peripheral vision. She was the daughter of Lord Marcus Ashcombe, a name that had once carried weight in the southern provinces before a series of catastrophic investments and political miscalculations had reduced House Ashcombe to a bloodline surviving on credit and the memory of former glory. The court already knew her story. Everyone knew everyone's story in this world. It was the primary currency. Her family had arranged her engagement to Lord Cedric Halwyn, heir to one of the Empire's wealthiest houses, in exchange for debt forgiveness and continued social standing. She was, in the blunt vocabulary of aristocratic commerce, a transaction. What the court did not expect was the way she wore it. Silver silk fitted close and unapologetic, chin level, eyes forward, no lowered gaze, no performative modesty, no visible evidence that she was walking into a room full of people who considered her a commodity. She moved through the great hall the way weather moves through a valley, not asking permission, not apologizing for the disturbance. The petitioner finished his plea. Cedric delivered his verdict. The court applauded, or pretended to. And when the business concluded and the feast began, the Duke descended from his throne for the first time that evening. The court noticed. The court always noticed when Cedric moved because his movements were rare and deliberate and historically preceded someone's destruction. He crossed the hall toward her. Conversations died in concentric circles as he passed, each cluster of nobles falling silent one after another like candles being snuffed in sequence. By the time he reached Seraphina Ashcombe, the only sound in the hall was the crackle of the fireplace and the distant howl of wind against the castle walls. She did not step back. She did not curtsy. She stood there and looked at him the way you might look at a storm approaching across an open field. Not with courage, exactly, with assessment. Cedric stopped close enough that the candlelight caught the old scar along his jaw, a thin white line from the night of the fire that he had never bothered to have treated because vanity was a luxury and luxuries were debts. He raised one gloved hand and lifted her chin. The gesture was deliberate, invasive, designed to establish dominance the way touching a horse's face established control. It was a language he spoke fluently. Every woman he had ever touched had flinched or softened or submitted to it. Seraphina did none of those things. She held his gaze the way a second hand holds a dueling blade. Steady, aware, ready. "You have been taught to survive wolves," Cedric said. His voice was low enough that only she could hear it, the register he used for threats and negotiations, the voice that had made grown men confess to crimes they had not committed. "No, Your Grace," she said. "I was taught never to kneel before them." The silence in the hall became absolute. Something moved behind Cedric Vale's expression. Not warmth, not amusement. Something older and more dangerous than either. Something that lived in the place where control met its own limits and discovered with genuine surprise that limits existed. He dropped his hand. "You will stay at court," he said. "I have not been asked to stay. I am not asking." He turned and walked back toward the throne. The court exhaled collectively, as though a blade had been held to the room's throat and then slowly withdrawn, and the feast resumed with the desperate energy of people trying very hard to pretend they had not just witnessed something unprecedented. Cedric did not eat. He sat on his throne and watched the hall the way a general watches a battlefield from an elevated position, tracking alliances and betrayals in the way nobles leaned toward each other, the way laughter moved through groups, the way certain people avoided certain others. His mind processed the information automatically, filing threats and opportunities into categories that would inform decisions over the coming weeks. But his attention kept returning to her. She sat at the far end of the lower table, placed there deliberately by the court steward because House Ashcombe's diminished status warranted diminished seating. She ate slowly and spoke to no one and did not look at the Duke. That last detail bothered him in a way he could not immediately classify. Everyone looked at him. It was a reflex, a survival mechanism, the way prey animals kept predators in their line of sight. She was ignoring him the way you ignored furniture. He found himself, for the first time in longer than he could remember, uncertain whether he was being challenged or dismissed. The distinction mattered enormously. Over the following days, Cedric ordered Seraphina to remain at Blackthorn under the official justification of protecting her family from creditors who had threatened seizure proceedings against the Ashcombe estates. The excuse was transparent. Every person in the castle understood that a duke did not extend financial protection to the daughter of a ruined house unless he intended to claim her, the way you claimed territory, the way you claimed strategic assets, the way you claimed anything that might otherwise fall into enemy hands. And enemies were already circling. Vivienne observed Serafina's presence at court with the focused hostility of a woman who understood power as a finite resource. Every ounce of the Duke's attention directed toward the Ashcombe girl was an ounce diverted from Vivienne's carefully maintained influence over Ravencroft's internal politics. She had spent 7 years since Aldrin's death building a network of alliances within the duchy, positioning herself as an indispensable advisor, and she had not done all of that to watch a silver-dressed nobody steal the architecture of her ambition. She is a distraction, Vivienne told Lord Malrec over wine in her private chambers, 3 nights after the midwinter feast. Cedric collects weapons, not women. The question is what he intends to use her for. Perhaps his intentions are simpler than that. Nothing about Cedric Vale is simple, Malrec. He does not want. He acquires. There is a difference, and if you cannot see it, you are less useful to me than I thought. Malrec swallowed his wine and said nothing. Meanwhile, Lord Cedric Halwyn arrived at Blackthorn Castle with an entourage of 40 men and the expectation that his engagement to Serafina would proceed on schedule. Halwyn was golden-haired, broad-shouldered, and possessed of the specific brand of confidence that enormous inherited wealth produces in men who have never been told no. He wanted Serafina not because he loved her or even desired her particularly, but because the Ashcombe bloodline carried ancient territorial claims that, once married into, would give House Halwyn legal access to trade routes currently controlled by Ravencroft. The politics were layered enough to choke on. Cedric received Halwyn in the War Chamber rather than the Great Hall, a choice of location that everyone understood as a statement. War Chambers were where you discussed threats. Halwyn was being classified. Lord Halwyn, you are early. The engagement was formalized last spring, Your Grace. I have merely arrived to conclude the arrangements. In my duchy. Lady Ashcombe is not a citizen of Ravencroft. The engagement was brokered through the Imperial Court. Lady Ashcombe is currently under my protection. Her affairs are Ravencroft's affairs until I determine otherwise. Halwyn's smile remained fixed, but something behind his eyes recalculated. He was not stupid, entitled, certainly, arrogant, undeniably, but not stupid. He recognized the Duke's language for what it was. Your Grace, I mean no disrespect to Ravencroft's sovereignty. I ask only to meet with my betrothed. You may see her at court, under supervision. The word supervision landed in the room like a slap. Halwyn's jaw tightened. He bowed stiffly and withdrew, and Cedric watched him leave with the distant satisfaction of a man who had just told an approaching storm exactly where it was permitted to rain. But the satisfaction lasted only until evening, when Cedric found himself standing outside the council chamber, listening to a voice he had not authorized to speak. Serafina was inside. She was addressing 3 senior ministers who managed Ravencroft's agricultural distribution, and she was telling them, in precise and unapologetic language, that the current system of grain allocation was starving the outer villages while the inner provinces hoarded surplus. The rationing formula has not been updated in 9 years, she said. 9 years ago, the outer villages had half their current population. You are feeding 6,000 people on a calculation designed for 3,000, and the surplus sits in warehouses 40 miles from the nearest famine. Minister Gareth Tolan leaned back in his chair with the indulgent expression of a man listening to a child explain weather. My lady, the distribution formula accounts for military supply chain priorities. We cannot simply redirect grain from strategic reserves because village populations have shifted. Strategic reserves that have not been accessed in 4 years are not strategic. They are waste. And the people eating bark soup at the base of the Ashfall Mountains do not care about your formula. Perhaps, my lady, you should leave the governance of Ravencroft to those who understand its complexities. I understand that children are dying, Minister. How complex would you like to make that? Cedric stood in the corridor and did not enter the room. He listened, and what he heard was not a woman performing compassion for political advantage, not a noble playing the role of benevolent outsider to gain social currency. What he heard was genuine fury, the kind that came from somewhere real, somewhere personal, somewhere that had nothing to do with him or Ravencroft or the game being played around her. She meant it. That was the part he could not assimilate. In Caedric Vale's experience, everyone performed. Every emotion was a tactic. Every moral position was a lever. Every act of apparent sincerity was a calculated investment in future advantage. He had built his entire worldview on that assumption, and the assumption had never failed him. And now this woman was defending people she had never met with a ferocity that bore no visible signature of self-interest. It unsettled him the way a crack in a fortress wall unsettles a general. Not because the crack itself is dangerous, because it suggests the wall is not as permanent as he believed. He entered the room. The three ministers scrambled to their feet. Seraphina turned to face him and did not scramble. "Your Grace," Tolan began, "Lady Ashcombe was simply expressing a concern about provincial distribution. We were explaining the established protocols." "Leave us," Caedric said. The ministers left. The door closed. Caedric and Seraphina stood on opposite sides of the long council table with maps of Ravencroft spread between them, like a battlefield rendered in ink and parchment. "You're making enemies of men who control food supplies," Caedric said. "They are already enemies of the people they are supposed to feed. That is not your concern." "Whose concern is it? Yours?" The question was not rhetorical. It was an accusation wrapped in 5 words, and it hit Caedric in a place he had spent 2 decades fortifying against exactly this kind of strike. Because the honest answer was that no, it was not his concern. Starving villages were statistical noise in the machinery of empire. He had never visited the outer settlements. He had never seen bark soup. He managed Ravencroft the way you managed a war. From above, from distance, from the safety of abstraction. "You are a guest in this castle," he said. "You do not set policy, and you do not notice the cost of yours." He stepped closer. Not to intimidate, not consciously. Something deeper than strategy moved him forward, something that recognized in her words a truth he had been refusing to hear from the walls of this castle for years. "Be very careful, Lady Ashcombe." "Of what? You have already taken my family's name, my future husband's cooperation, and my freedom to leave. What else is there to threaten?" "I could make you irrelevant." "You could try." They stood there, separated by the table and by the vast, trembling distance between a man who had survived by controlling everything and a woman who had survived by refusing to be controlled. The candles threw their shadows against the stone walls, 2 dark shapes leaning toward each other like arguments that refused to end. Caedric turned away first. He walked to the window and looked out at the black snow falling over Ravencroft, at the torches flickering in the courtyard below, at the kingdom he had built from trauma and blood, and the absolute certainty that power was the only currency that could not be stolen. "My mother was murdered in this castle," he said. He did not know why he said it. The words left his mouth the way a wound opens, not by choice, by pressure. "My brothers. I was 14. I hid beneath the floor and listened to them die." The room went silent. "I built every wall in this duchy from that night forward, every army, every law, every tax, every punishment, because I swore that no one would ever have the power to take something from me again." Seraphina did not respond immediately. When she spoke, her voice had lost its edge, not softened, sharpened differently, the way a blade is sharpened against a different stone. "And did it work?" He turned and looked at her. "Has anything been taken from you since?" The question pierced through 20 years of fortification like a needle through cloth, because the answer was yes. Everything. His capacity for trust, his ability to sleep, his connection to the human beings who lived and worked and died in the shadow of his protection. He had saved Ravencroft by hollowing out the man who ruled it, and the fortress he built was perfect, except for the fact that there was nothing inside it worth defending. He did not say any of that. He said, "You will attend the Imperial Ascension Ball in 3 weeks. The Emperor has requested Ravencroft's presence." "As what? Your prisoner or your ornament?" "As my guest." "There is no difference in this castle." She left the council chamber, and Caedric stood alone with the maps and the candles and the sound of black snow hitting the windows like 1,000 small fists demanding entry. 3 weeks passed. 3 weeks of court intrigue and military briefings, and Vivian's poisoned whispers spreading through the aristocracy like ink through water. 3 weeks of Lord Halloween's increasing frustration, of letters to the imperial court demanding intervention, of backroom alliances forming and dissolving in the toxic atmosphere of Blackthorn Castle, and 3 weeks of Caedric Vale watching Serafina Ashcombe move through the brutal machinery of his court without bowing, without breaking, without ever once giving him the satisfaction of submission. He watched her argue with ministers. He watched her convince the castle physician to send medical supplies to the outer villages using her own rapidly diminishing family funds. He watched her walk alone through the cathedral wing at night, standing before marble statues of dead rulers. And he followed her there once, standing in the doorway, listening to her breathe in the cold stone silence. They all believed power would save them, she said without turning, knowing he was there the way you know weather is changing. Power is the only reason their names survived. And yet they still died afraid. He had no answer for that. Not because she was wrong, because she was right, and the rightness of it scraped against something inside him that he had been calling strength for 20 years, and now suspected might be something else entirely. The night of the Imperial Ascension Ball arrived like a blade drawn from its sheath. The Imperial Palace blazed with 10,000 candles, and the combined wealth of an empire gathered in one glittering room. Chandeliers hung like captured constellations. Music swelled through halls lined with gold leaf and ancient tapestries depicting victories that had cost more lives than anyone in the room cared to remember. Emperor Adrian sat on a throne elevated above the ballroom floor, watching his nobles the way Caedric watched his, from above, from distance, with the calm, calculating awareness that every smile below contained a weapon. Caedric entered with Serafina at his side, and the ballroom responded the way all rooms responded to the Duke of Blackthorn. Conversations faltered, bodies shifted. A corridor of space opened through the crowd as though proximity to him required careful negotiation. Serafina wore dark blue velvet, no silver this time, no armor. She had chosen the color of deep water, of night sky before the last light dies, and she walked beside the most feared man in the empire with the unhurried gait of a woman who had stopped calculating her survival and started deciding her own terms. 3 dances passed, 2 diplomatic conversations, 1 thinly veiled threat from the Emperor's Chancellor regarding Ravencroft's border policies. Standard procedure. Then Emperor Adrian stood. The ballroom fell silent with the trained obedience of an audience that understood the consequences of inattention. "Tonight," the Emperor announced, his voice carrying the practiced resonance of a man who had been performing authority since birth, "we celebrate the union of 2 great houses, Lord Cedric Halloween and Lady Serafina Ashcombe." Applause erupted. Halloween stepped forward from the crowd, golden and smiling and triumphant, extending his hand towards Serafina with the proprietary confidence of a man collecting a purchase. Serafina did not move. She looked at Caedric, not pleading, not frightened, furious, the kind of fury that lives beneath composure like magma, beneath stone, the kind that does not beg for rescue because begging is just another form of surrender. And in that fury, Caedric saw something he recognized, himself. At 14. Pinned beneath burning wreckage, listening to someone else decide whether he lived or died. The old machinery inside him, the machinery built from smoke and screams and 20 years of absolute control, engaged with a sound like iron gears locking into place. He did not think. Thinking was what he did when he was managing empires and calculating risks and maintaining the architecture of power that kept Ravencroft alive. This was not thinking. This was the thing that existed before thinking, the raw, ungovernable impulse that he had spent his entire adult life trying to bury because it was the one force he could not control. He crossed the ballroom floor. Every step was a declaration of war. He took Serafina's hand from where Halloween was reaching for it, and the Golden Lord's smile shattered like glass hitting stone. "She belongs to Ravencroft," Caedric said. His voice filled the ballroom without effort, the voice of a man who had never needed to shout because the world had learned to listen when he whispered. Emperor Adrian rose from his throne. His face was the color of a man watching his authority challenged before the assembled might of his own empire. "You would defy the throne itself, Blackthorn?" Caedric's gaze did not leave Serafina. His hand did not release hers. And when he spoke, the words came from somewhere deeper than politics. deeper than strategy, deeper than the 20-year-old architecture of control that had made him untouchable. I would burn kingdoms before surrendering what is mine. The gasps that tore through the ballroom sounded like fabric ripping. Halloween reached for his sword. Imperial guards surged forward. The Emperor's Chancellor screamed for order, and Caedric Vale, Duke of Blackthorn, lifted Seraphina Ashcombe into his arms and carried her from the Imperial Palace while 300 nobles watched, and not a single soldier moved to stop him, because every man in that room understood what the rest of the Empire was about to learn. Ravencroft's armies could drown the continent in civil war by sunrise. The palace doors slammed behind them like a coffin lid closing on the old world. By dawn, the gates of Blackthorn Castle sealed shut. By noon, riders carried declarations of sovereignty to every province in the empire. And by nightfall, as black snow fell over Ravencroft like a funeral shroud, Emperor Adrian signed the order that Caedric Vale had been building toward his entire life without knowing it. The order for war. But the war that was coming would not be fought on battlefields or decided by armies. It would be fought in the corridors of Blackthorn Castle itself, where Duchess Vivienne Morcant stood in her private chambers reading a letter she had been waiting 7 years to receive. A letter that bore the imperial seal and contained a single word that made her smile the way a blade smiles when it catches the light. The word was yes. The letter burned in Vivienne Morcant's hands for 3 days before she acted on it. Not because she hesitated. Vivienne had not hesitated since the night she watched her husband Aldrin Vale die in the hunting forest, and realized, standing over his body while the dogs howled and the torchlight caught the blood pooling beneath his skull, that hesitation was a luxury designed for people who could afford to lose. She kept the letter because timing was everything, and the Emperor's single-word authorization meant nothing if deployed at the wrong moment against the wrong pressure point. She needed Caedric vulnerable first, and for the first time in 20 years, he was. The castle sealed itself like a wound closing. Gates bolted with iron bars thick as a man's forearm. Sentries doubled on every wall. The black snow continued falling over Ravencroft in sheets so dense that the mountain passes became impassable within 48 hours of the Duke's return from the Imperial Palace, which meant that the 300 nobles who had attended Midwinter Court were now trapped inside Blackthorn with a man who had just declared war on the Empire. The panic was immediate and total. Lord Durnwood cornered Commander Theros in the armory before sunrise. "This is suicide. He has condemned us all. The Emperor will march on Ravencroft before the spring thaw, and every family sheltering under this roof will be branded traitors." Theros adjusted the strap on his sword belt with the mechanical calm of a man who had learned to separate emotion from function the way a butcher separates bone from meat. "The Duke's decision is final. The Duke's decision is insane." "Those are frequently the same thing in Ravencroft, Lord Durnwood. I suggest you find a comfortable room and stay in it." Durnwood's face went the color of old wax. He retreated into the labyrinth of corridors that connected Blackthorn's inner chambers, and within the hour, the whisper network that sustained aristocratic survival had carried the news to every occupied room in the castle. The Duke had lost his mind. The Duke had started a war over a woman. The Duke was going to get them all killed, none of which was entirely wrong. Caedric stood in the war chamber at the center of the castle, the room where his father had planned campaigns and his grandfather had signed treaties, and every Duke of Blackthorn before him had stared at the same maps and made the same calculation. How much blood does sovereignty cost today? The maps were spread across the oak table, weighted at the corners with iron figurines representing troop positions, and Caedric moved them with his fingers the way a musician moves across keys. Instinct refined by repetition. The eastern pass was defensible with 600 men. The southern approach required 1,000. The river crossing at Greymarch was the weak point, always had been, and if the Emperor's generals had any competence at all, they would strike there first. "How long before they mobilize?" he asked without looking up. Theros stood at the door. "Imperial Standing Army needs 3 weeks to march north in winter conditions, but Adrian will send ravens to the border lords first. Halloween's forces can reach our southern perimeter in 8 days. Halloween is not a soldier. He is a rich man with an army. Rich men with armies have won wars before, Your Grace." "Not against me." Theros said nothing. The silence between them carried the weight of 11 years of shared understanding, 11 years of battles and purges and decisions that had turned Ravencroft from a fractured duchy into the most feared territory in the Empire. But something had shifted in the last 72 hours, and Theros could feel it the way old wounds feel weather changes. The Duke was not calculating, he was reacting. And reactive men made mistakes that calculating men did not survive. Your Grace, may I speak freely? You always speak freely, Theros. That is why you are still alive. The court believes you took Lady Ashcombe from the ball as an act of possession. If that is the case, the strategic cost is catastrophic. We are looking at a two-front war with insufficient supply lines and a civilian population that cannot sustain extended siege conditions. And if it is not the case, then I need to understand what it is, because I cannot defend a position I cannot define. Cedric's hand stopped moving on the map. His fingers rested on the iron figurine representing Blackthorn Castle itself, a small black tower no larger than his thumb. And for a moment the silence in the war chamber was so complete that the sound of snow hitting the windows became the loudest thing in the room. I do not know what it is, he said. Theros blinked. In 11 years he had never heard the Duke admit uncertainty about anything. He had watched Cedric order executions with less hesitation than most men ordered breakfast. The admission landed in the room like a foreign object, something that did not belong in the architecture of Blackthorn's command structure. I saw her face, Cedric continued, in the ballroom, when Adrian announced the engagement, and I saw something I recognized. What? The moment before you stop being a person and become a thing that other people use. Theros exhaled slowly. He understood. He had been there, in a different form, in the years before Cedric found him in a military prison awaiting execution for striking a superior officer. He had been the thing other people used, and the Duke had looked at him through the bars of that cell and said, "You hit him because he deserved it. Come work for me." The court does not care about your reasons, Your Grace. They care about survival. Then they should be grateful I am the one making the decisions. Cedric rolled the maps and left the war chamber without another word. He found Seraphina in the library. She was sitting in a chair by the window with a book she was not reading, staring at the black snow falling over the courtyard below. The library was the oldest room in Blackthorn Castle, its walls lined with texts that predated the duchy itself, and the air smelled of old leather and cold stone and the particular kind of dust that accumulates in rooms where knowledge goes to be forgotten. She did not stand when he entered. She did not acknowledge him at all for several seconds, and in those seconds Cedric experienced something he had not felt since childhood, the sensation of being irrelevant in a room he owned. "You have not eaten," he said. "I am not hungry." That was not a question about your appetite. It was a statement about your behavior. You have not eaten in 36 hours. Are you tracking my meals now? I track everything in this castle. She closed the book and looked at him. Her eyes were dark and steady and carried the particular quality of exhaustion that comes not from lack of sleep, but from the sustained effort of processing an impossible situation without the luxury of breaking down. "What happens now?" she asked. "War." "Because of me." Because of the Emperor's ambition and Halloween's greed and 20 years of political tension that was going to ignite regardless of what happened in that ballroom. That is a very convenient way to avoid the truth. The truth is complicated. The truth is that you carried me out of the Imperial Palace like property, in front of the entire Empire, without asking me, without consulting me, without giving me the basic dignity of a choice. The words hit him in a place that his usual defenses did not cover, because his usual defenses were designed to absorb attacks from enemies, and Seraphina was not attacking him from a position of hostility. She was attacking him from a position of accuracy. "You would have preferred Halloween?" he said. "I would have preferred to be asked." "Asked what?" "Whether I wanted to be saved." The sentence hung between them like a blade suspended by a thread. Cedric felt something shift inside his chest, a tectonic movement beneath the surface of his carefully maintained control, and he recognized it with the cold clarity of a man diagnosing his own illness. She was right. He had not asked. He had acted the way he always acted, from instinct and authority and the bone-deep assumption that his judgment superseded everyone else's, and in doing so he had replicated the exact dynamic he thought he was rescuing her from. He had taken her from one cage and placed her in another. His jaw worked silently for a moment. The scar along his jawline whitened as the muscles beneath it tightened. "I do not know how to ask," he said. The admission cost him something visible. His posture changed, not dramatically, not in any way that a casual observer would notice. But Serafina was not a casual observer. She saw the fraction of an inch that his shoulders dropped, the way his breathing shifted from the controlled rhythm of authority to something raw and less regulated. "Then learn," she said, "or this war you have started will destroy both of us." She stood and left the library. The door closed behind her with a sound like a period at the end of a sentence that had been building for weeks. Kadric stood in the empty room and listened to her footsteps fade down the corridor and felt, for the first time since the night of the fire, completely and terrifyingly exposed. The next 5 days reshaped the interior geography of Blackthorn Castle from a seat of power into a pressure chamber. Vivienne moved first. She invited 12 of the most influential trapped nobles to a private dinner in the East Wing, ostensibly to discuss collective safety measures during the impending siege. The dinner was elegant, the wine was imported, the conversation was treason. "The Emperor offers full amnesty to any Ravencroft house that withdraws support from the Duke before hostilities begin," Vivienne announced, her voice carrying the warm, reasonable tone of a woman presenting a perfectly rational solution to an insane problem. "Lord Dernwood, Lord Ashford, Lady Pemberton, you all have families, children, estates that will be seized and burned if Caedric's war goes forward. Adrian is not offering you a betrayal. He is offering you survival." Lord Dernwood's hands trembled around his wine glass. "And what does the Emperor offer you, Vivienne?" "Regency of Ravencroft." The table went quiet. "You want his throne," Lady Pemberton said. "I want stability. Caedric is a weapon. Weapons are useful in wartime and catastrophic in peacetime, and this duchy has been at war with itself for 20 years because its ruler does not know how to exist without an enemy. I am offering you a future where Ravencroft does not burn to the ground because one man cannot control his appetites." "His appetites," Dernwood repeated. "You mean Lady Ashcombe?" "I mean everything. The woman is a symptom. The disease is Caedric himself." The nobles exchanged glances across the table. 12 faces performing 12 separate calculations about loyalty and self-preservation, and which of those two values was more likely to keep their children alive through the winter. 7 of them agreed before the wine was finished. Vivienne smiled the way a surgeon smiles before the first incision. On the 4th night, an assassin entered Serafina's chambers through a passage concealed behind the fireplace. The assassin was young and professional and very nearly successful. He crossed the room in 4 silent steps, blade drawn, reaching for the bed where Serafina's shape lay beneath heavy blankets. His hand pulled back the covers and found pillows arranged to simulate a sleeping body. Behind him, Serafina pressed a stolen kitchen knife against his throat. She had not slept in the bed for 2 nights. She had slept in the window alcove behind the curtains, dressed in dark clothes, with the knife under her arm, because she had grown up in a ruined house surrounded by creditors and enemies, and she had learned, long before Blackthorn Castle, that the safest place in any room was the place nobody expected you to be. "Who sent you?" she said. Her voice was steady. The knife was not. The assassin was trained enough to recognize the tremor and calculate his odds. He spun. The knife opened a shallow cut across his neck. He struck her arm and the blade clattered to the stone floor, and then his hands were on her throat and the room went dark at the edges, and she could hear her own heartbeat slamming against the inside of her skull, like something trying to escape. The door exploded inward. Caedric did not enter the room so much as occupy it, the way fire occupies a space. He crossed the distance between the door and the assassin in 3 strides, tore the man off Serafina with one hand, and drove him into the stone wall with enough force to crack the plaster behind his skull. "Who?" Caedric said. The assassin's feet dangled 6 inches off the ground. Caedric held him by the throat with one hand, and the Duke's face in the torchlight was something that belonged in the deepest nightmares of the men who had tried to kill his family 20 years ago. Not angry, not furious. Empty. The kind of empty that precedes total destruction, the calm at the center of a hurricane that exists only because everything around it is being annihilated. "Who sent you?" The assassin choked. His lips formed a word that might have been a name or might have been a plea. Kedrick adjusted his grip, and the choking became more precise, more targeted, the compression of a man who understood exactly how much pressure a human throat could sustain before the structures inside it collapsed permanently. "Kedrick," Seraphina's voice came from behind him, hoarse, scraped raw. "Kedrick, stop." He did not stop. His hand tightened. "If you kill him, you kill the information." The logic penetrated where the plea had not. Kedrick's grip loosened fractionally. The assassin gasped, sucking air through a throat that would bruise black by morning. "Talk," Kedrick said, "or I will find every person you have ever loved and show them what happens to the people who come into my house uninvited." The assassin talked. He was a mercenary hired through 3 layers of intermediaries, standard protocol for aristocratic assassination to ensure deniability. But the payment had come through a specific channel, a banking house in the eastern provinces that handled only one client in Ravencroft, Duchess Vivienne Morcant. Kedrick dropped the assassin. The man crumpled to the floor like a puppet whose strings had been severed. 2 guards arrived and dragged him away, and then Kedrick and Seraphina were alone in her chambers with the torn bedding and the blood on the floor and the cold air rushing through the open door. Kedrick's hands were shaking, not from exertion, from the adrenaline crash that follows the activation of a survival response so deeply encoded that it bypasses conscious thought entirely. His body had reacted to the threat against Seraphina with the same blind, annihilating urgency that it had once used to keep a 14-year-old boy alive beneath burning wreckage. And now that the threat was neutralized, the machinery was spinning down and leaving behind a tremor that he could not control. He could not control it. That was the part that frightened him. "Are you hurt?" he said. His voice was flat, stripped of inflection, the default setting his nervous system reverted to when emotion threatened to overwhelm function. "Bruised, not broken. I will post guards at your door." "You already post guards at my door. He came through the wall." "Then I will seal every passage in this castle." "You cannot seal a castle against the people who live in it, Kedrick. That is the point." He looked at her. She was sitting on the edge of the bed with her hand pressed against her throat where the bruises were already darkening, and her eyes were wet. But she was not crying, because crying required surrender, and Seraphina Ashcombe had apparently decided that surrender was not available to her regardless of circumstance. "Vivienne," he said. "Yes. She has been working against me since Aldrin died. Longer than that, I think." "What do you mean?" Seraphina hesitated. Then she spoke, and what she said rearranged every assumption Kedrick Vale had held about his own history. "The night your family was murdered, the coup. Your uncle organized it. Everyone knows that. But your uncle was a drunk and a fool who could not organize a dinner table, let alone an assassination. Someone else planned it. Someone who understood the castle's passages. Someone who knew which guards to bribe and which doors would be unlocked, and exactly where your mother would be sleeping that night." Kedrick's breathing stopped. "Vivienne was engaged to your brother Aldrin before the coup. She was in this castle the week it happened. She was one of 3 people who knew the layout of the private quarters." "You are speculating." "I am telling you what I found in the archive records 3 days ago. Guard rotation logs from the night of the massacre. Someone altered the watch schedule for the West Wing 2 hours before the attack. The alteration was authorized by the steward's office, and the steward at the time reported directly to Vivienne's father. The room became a vacuum. Sound ceased. Air ceased. The entire universe contracted to a single point located behind Kedrick Vale's sternum, where the 14-year-old boy who had survived by accident was suddenly screaming through 20 years of carefully constructed silence. Vivienne. She had been there, at every meal, at every council session, at every midwinter feast for 7 years, sitting at his table, drinking his wine, smiling that beautiful blade-sharp smile, while the ashes of his family settled into the foundations of the very castle she walked through like she owned it. Because she did own it. She had purchased it with their blood. His vision tunneled. His pulse decelerated to the slow, heavy rhythm that preceded violence. The biological preparation for a physical response, so ancient that it predated language and thought and everything he had ever built on top of the burning boy's survival. Kaedric. Seraphina's hand closed around his wrist. Her grip was firm, not gentle. Firm. The grip of a person who understood that gentleness would be interpreted as weakness and weakness would be ignored. If you go to her now, you will kill her. And if you kill her without proof, without witnesses, without the court seeing what she is, then you become exactly what the Emperor says you are, a tyrant ruling through murder, and everything you have built dies with her. His eyes found hers. The tunneled vision widened fractionally. The pulse remained heavy. I want her dead. I know, and she will be, but not like this, not in the dark, not the way she killed your family. The words landed, not because they were rational, because they were true. Vivienne had killed in shadows. She had operated through intermediaries and altered guard logs and plausible deniability. And if Kaedric destroyed her the same way, then the method of justice would be indistinguishable from the crime, and the cycle would continue, and the burning boy would never stop screaming. He pulled his wrist from Seraphina's grip, not violently, slowly, with the deliberate care of a man handling something that might detonate. What do you suggest? The Crimson Assembly, 5 days from now. Every noble in this castle will attend. Vivienne will be there. Her allies will be there. Let me present what I found, in front of everyone. Let the court see who she is. And if the court sides with her, they will not side with a woman who murdered children. You do not know this court. I know people, and people can tolerate cruelty from a man they fear, but they cannot tolerate a woman who murders children and then smiles at the dinner table for 7 years. That is not power, Kaedric. That is a horror that even the most cynical noble cannot swallow. He stared at her for a long time. The snow hit the windows. The torches crackled in the corridor outside. Somewhere deep in the castle, a door slammed and voices carried and the machinery of Blackthorn ground forward through the dark. 5 days, he said. 5 days. He turned toward the door, then stopped. I will sleep outside your chambers tonight. You do not need to do that. I was not asking. The faintest shadow of something crossed Seraphina's bruised face. Not a smile. Something older than a smile. Something that existed in the space between gratitude and recognition. The acknowledgement that a man who does not know how to ask is trying, in the only language he speaks, to learn. He took a chair from the corridor and placed it against the wall outside her door and sat in it with his sword across his knees and did not sleep. The next 5 days bled into each other like ink spreading through water. Vivienne continued building her coalition with the serene confidence of a woman who believed her position was unassailable. 7 nobles committed, then 9, then 11. She held private audiences and whispered promises and dispensed the Emperor's guarantees like currency, and the texture of the castle changed around her. Servants who once bowed to Kaedric now hesitated half a second before the bow. A delay so small it was almost imperceptible, but which Theros noticed and catalogued with the grim precision of a man compiling a casualty list before the battle begins. Seraphina spent those 5 days in the archives. She worked 18 hours a day, pulling records from storage rooms that had not been opened in decades, cross-referencing guard schedules and financial transfers, and correspondence between Vivienne's family and the conspirators who had carried out the massacre. She ate at her desk. She slept in the archive chair. She built her case the way Kaedric built his fortifications, stone by stone, gap by gap, until the structure was complete and the truth it contained was undeniable. Kaedric watched her work. He stood in the archive doorway at odd hours, saying nothing, observing the way she moved through documents with the focused intensity of a woman who understood that the difference between evidence and accusation was the difference between victory and execution. She was fighting for him, not because he had asked her to, not because she owed him anything. She was fighting because the truth was worth fighting for, and that concept was so alien to Kaedric's understanding of human motivation that he could not process it through any framework he possessed. People did not fight for truth. They fought for advantage. They fought for survival. They fought for territory and wealth and the elimination of threats. Truth was a tool, not a cause, unless you were Seraphina Ashcombe. in which case truth was the weapon you chose when every other weapon had been taken from you. On the fourth night, he brought her food, set it on the desk without comment, stood by the window while she ate. "You do not have to stay," she said between bites of bread and cold meat. "I know." "Then why are you here?" He considered the question, turned it over inside the machinery of his mind the way he would turn over a tactical problem, examining it from every angle, testing for weaknesses and traps and hidden implications. "Because this room is the only place in this castle where I do not feel like the Duke of Blackthorn." She stopped chewing, looked at him. The candlelight threw his profile against the stone wall, all hard angles and scar tissue, and the rigid posture of a man who carried his authority like a physical weight distributed across his shoulders and spine. "What do you feel like?" "I do not know. Something less. Something that does not require walls." She set down the bread. "That is not less, Cedric. That is more." He did not respond, but he stayed until she fell asleep in the archive chair, and then he covered her with his military cloak and returned to his post outside her chambers, and sat in the dark with his sword across his knees and thought about what it might mean to be more by becoming less, and whether a man who had built himself entirely out of fortifications could survive the dismantling. The morning of the Crimson Assembly arrived under skies the color of bruised iron. The great hall filled with every noble trapped in Blackthorn Castle. 300 bodies in silk and velvet and military dress, seated in concentric rows around the central floor where the Duke's throne stood on its raised stone platform. Candles blazed. The air smelled of tallow and sweat, and the particular metallic tang of collective fear. Vivienne took her seat at the high table with the composed elegance of a woman who believed she was attending her own coronation. Her 11 allied nobles were positioned throughout the hall, each one briefed, each one ready to second her motion of no confidence when the moment came. Cedric entered last. He wore black, no insignia, no rank markers. The absence of decoration was so pronounced that it functioned as a statement louder than any crown. He crossed the hall to the throne and did not sit. He stood before it, facing the assembled court, and the silence that followed was the kind that precedes earthquakes. "Ravencroft is at war," he said. His voice did not rise. It did not need to. "The Emperor's armies march on our borders. Lord Halloween's forces approach from the south, and inside these walls, someone has been selling our survival to the highest bidder." Vivienne's expression did not change, but her fingers, resting on the table, pressed fractionally harder against the wood. "I invited you here today not to discuss strategy. Commander Theros handles strategy. I invited you here because a murder committed 20 years ago in this castle has never been answered, and the murderer is sitting in this room." 300 bodies stopped breathing simultaneously. Cedric stepped aside. Serafina walked to the center of the floor carrying a leather case filled with 20 years of evidence, and the Duchess Vivienne Morcant, for the first time since the night she had watched the West Wing burn, felt the architecture of her ambition begin to crack. And Serafina opened the case. Serafina laid the first document on the stone floor where 300 pairs of eyes could see it, and the silence in the great hall became something with weight, something you could feel pressing against your eardrums like the pressure change before a storm breaks. On the night of the 14th of October, 20 years ago, the guard rotation for the west wing of Blackthorn Castle was altered. Her voice carried without strain, clear and unhurried, the voice of a woman who understood that truth did not need volume. It needed precision. The original schedule placed 4 sentries at the private family quarters between midnight and dawn. The altered schedule reduced that number to 1. A single guard, stationed at the far end of the corridor, facing away from the residential chambers. She placed the second document beside the first. The guard rotation log. Original and altered versions side by side. The handwriting on the alteration unmistakably different from the duty officer's script. The alteration was authorized through the steward's office. The steward at that time was a man named Garrett Wynne, who reported directly to Lord Harlan Morcant, Vivienne Morcant's father. Every head in the hall turned toward Vivienne. The Duchess sat at the high table with her hands folded and her expression arranged in the particular configuration of aristocratic composure that functions as a mask and a weapon simultaneously. She did not flinch. She did not pale. She looked at Serafina the way you look at an insect that has landed on your sleeve. with mild irritation and absolute confidence in your ability to brush it away. "This is absurd," Vivian said. Her voice was warm and slightly amused, the tone of a woman addressing a child's misunderstanding. Garrett Wynne was a functionary. He processed dozens of administrative orders daily. Linking a routine scheduling change to a conspiracy is the work of a desperate imagination. "Then perhaps you can explain this." Serafina placed the third document on the floor. A financial transfer record from the Morcant family's private banking house, dated 6 days before the massacre. The amount was 1,400 gold sovereigns. The recipient was listed only as a coded account, but Serafina had spent 4 days in the archives matching the code to a ledger entry in the banking house's secondary records, and the name attached to the account was Darius Cole. Darius Cole, Serafina said, was the man who led the assassination team into the West Wing. The hall erupted, not in shouts, in the rustling, hissing, seat-shifting chaos of 300 people trying to process information that rearranged the political landscape beneath their feet while simultaneously calculating their own exposure. Lord Durnwood's face had gone the color of wet ash. Lady Pemberton gripped the arms of her chair with whitening knuckles. The 11 nobles allied with Vivian exchanged glances that traveled around the room like sparks looking for fuel. Vivian stood. The movement was graceful, unhurried, and precisely calibrated to project authority. She was good at this. She had been good at this for 20 years. "Your Grace," she addressed Ceadric directly, bypassing Serafina as though the woman presenting evidence did not exist. "I will not dignify this theater with a detailed response. Lady Ashcombe is a guest in this castle, an uninvited guest, I might add, whose family's financial ruin has clearly driven her to fabricate accusations against the one person in Ravencroft who has consistently advocated for stability and measured governance." "Sit down, Vivian," Ceadric said. "I will not. This court deserves to understand what is happening. A woman with no standing, no title of consequence, and no authority is being permitted to level accusations of murder against a member of the ducal family based on 20-year-old paperwork that could have been altered, forged, or misinterpreted by anyone with access to the archives." "The archives were sealed," Serafina said. "By your order. 7 years ago, after your husband's death, you sealed them because you knew what was inside. I sealed them because they contained sensitive state documents, as was my right as Aldrin's widow and a member of the ruling household. You sealed them because Aldrin found the same records I found. The sentence detonated in the hall like a mortar round. Vivian's composure cracked, not visibly, not in any way that a casual observer would detect. But Ceadric saw it. He saw the micro-contraction of the muscles around her eyes, the fractional tightening of her jaw, the almost imperceptible shift in her center of gravity as her body absorbed a blow that her face refused to register. Serafina continued. She was moving faster now, pulling documents from the case with the focused urgency of a surgeon who has opened the patient and discovered something worse than expected. "Aldrin Vale did not die in a hunting accident. He died because he confronted you. He found these records in the archive 18 months before his death. He spent a year verifying them in secret, and then he came to you, his wife, the woman he trusted, and he asked you whether you had helped murder his family. You have no proof of that conversation. I have his journal." The air in the hall became vacuum. Serafina withdrew a leather-bound book from the bottom of the case. It was small, unremarkable, the kind of personal journal that a man might keep beside his bed for recording thoughts too dangerous to speak aloud. Its pages were yellowed and its spine was cracked, and it had been hidden behind a false panel in the archive wall for 7 years, waiting for someone to look in the one place that Vivian's seal was supposed to keep permanently closed. Aldrin wrote in this journal for 14 months before his death. He documented his investigation. He documented his confrontation with you. And he documented his growing certainty that the woman sleeping beside him every night had orchestrated the murder of his mother and his brothers when she was 22 years old. Vivian's mask held, but her breathing had changed. The elegant, measured rhythm of a woman in complete control had accelerated by 3 beats per minute, a shift so subtle that only someone trained to read physiological stress responses would catch it. Ceadric caught it. He had been trained by 20 years of reading enemies across negotiation tables and battlefield lines. and he watched Vivian's breathing the way a hunter watches the tremor in grass that reveals where the animal is hiding. "He was ill," Vivian said. Her voice maintained its warmth, but something beneath the warmth had shifted, the way the temperature of a river changes when a cold current enters from below. In the months before his death, Aldrin suffered from severe melancholia. He was delusional, paranoid. He accused servants of poisoning his food. He accused guards of conspiring against him. The journal of a sick man is not evidence. It is tragedy. Then explain the hunting accident. It was an accident. His horse threw him on a rocky trail. The physician confirmed the cause of death. The physician was Leland Cross, who left Ravencroft the day after Aldrin's funeral and was never seen again. His house was found empty. His records were burned, and a deposit of 800 gold sovereigns appeared in an offshore account registered to a man named Leland Cross 3 weeks later. Serafina placed the banking record on the floor beside the journal. "You paid him to falsify the death report, just as your father paid Darius Cole to kill Caedric's family, just as you paid the assassin who entered my chambers 4 nights ago." Lies. All of it. Fabricated by a desperate woman trying to secure her position in a castle where she has no right to exist. Then submit to a tribunal. Let an independent review examine the documents. If they are fabricated, you have nothing to fear. Vivian's eyes moved from Serafina to Caedric. And in that movement, in that single lateral shift of focus, something changed in the hall. Because Vivian was no longer looking at Serafina as an insect on her sleeve. She was looking at Caedric the way a cornered animal looks at the wall it cannot climb. Caedric. Her voice dropped to the warmth entirely. What remained was the bare scaffolding beneath the performance, the hard, calculating intelligence that had kept her alive and powerful for 2 decades. You and I have governed this duchy together for 7 years. I have counseled you. I have managed your court. I have kept your household functional while you played at war and terrified the Empire with your tantrums. Whatever this woman has convinced you of, remember that I am the only person in this castle who has never asked you for anything." "Because you already took everything," Caedric said. The words fell into the silence like stones into deep water. Ripples spread outward through the assembled court. Dernwood lowered his head. Pemberton closed her eyes. Vivian understood in that moment that the game had changed. Not shifted, changed. The architecture she had built over 20 years. The careful lattice of alliances and secrets and managed information that had made her untouchable was disintegrating in real time under the weight of documents she had believed were permanently buried. She made her decision in the space between one heartbeat and the next. "Lord Dernwood," she said. Her voice carried the snap of command. "Lord Ashford, Lady Pemberton, now." The signal was unmistakable. Vivian was activating her coalition. The 11 allied nobles were supposed to rise, declare no confidence in the Duke, and formally request imperial intervention under the emergency provisions of the duchy's charter. It was the plan they had agreed to over wine in Vivian's chambers. It was supposed to be orderly, dignified, the peaceful transfer of power dressed in legal language. Dernwood did not move. Ashford did not move. Pemberton did not move. Vivian's head turned slowly, scanning the hall, searching for her allies among the sea of frozen faces, and what she found was 11 people who had just watched the evidence of a 20-year-old massacre laid out on a stone floor and decided, individually and simultaneously, that the woman who had committed it was not the woman they wanted to follow into the next chapter of Ravencroft's history. Betrayal upon betrayal. The irony was so precise it could have drawn blood. "Commander Theros," Caedric said, "take the Duchess to the East Tower." Theros stepped forward with 2 guards. Vivian did not resist. She stood perfectly still while the guards flanked her, and as they began to escort her from the hall, she turned her head and looked at Caedric one final time. "You think this changes what you are?" she said. "You are still the boy under the floor. You will always be the boy under the floor. And every wall you build, every army you raise, every woman you try to hold on to will not change the fact that you survived by accident and you have been punishing the world for it ever since." Caedric's face did not move. Vivian was led from the hall. The doors closed behind her, and then the bell tower erupted. Not the measured ceremonial tolling that announced court sessions or feast days, the frantic, arrhythmic clanging that meant one thing and one thing only in the language of Blackthorn Castle. Breach. Theros reacted before the second bell finished ringing. He was at the window in 4 strides, pulling back the heavy curtain, and what he saw in the courtyard below made his face go white. "Your Grace, the southern gate is open." Kadric crossed the hall in 6 steps and looked down through the window into the courtyard where soldiers in imperial colors were pouring through the southern gate like water through a broken dam. Not Halloween's men. Imperial regulars. Professional soldiers in formation, shields locked, moving with the coordinated precision of an army that had been positioned and waiting for exactly this signal. "How many?" Kedrick said. 300, maybe 4. Advance force. The main column will be behind them." The gate was barred from the inside. "Yes, Your Grace." Then someone opened it from the inside. The realization hit the great hall like a physical blow. 300 nobles surged to their feet in a chaos of silk and panic. Chairs toppled, women screamed, men drew swords they had not used in decades and held them with the clumsy desperation of people who understood that the theoretical nature of their political alliances had just become extremely practical. Kadric grabbed Theros by the arm. "Who was on the south gate?" "Sergeant Brennan, 6 men. Brennan has served me for 9 years. Vivian has had 9 years to turn him." The logic was inescapable, and it struck Kaedric in the precise location where certainty lived. 9 years. He had trusted Brennan the way he trusted the stones in the walls and the iron in the gates, with the unexamined confidence of a man who believed his judgment of loyalty was infallible. And Vivian had been underneath that confidence the entire time, the way rot lives underneath paint, invisible until the structure collapses. His mind shifted from shock to calculation in under 3 seconds. The shift was physical. His pupils contracted. His breathing dropped to a rate so slow it was nearly imperceptible. His hands stopped shaking and became instruments again, precise and purposeful, and devoid of the tremor that had plagued them since the night of the assassination attempt. "Theros, how many men do we have inside the walls?" "Garrison strength is 200. But if Vivian has been turning soldiers, I cannot guarantee loyalty counts. Assume 50% compromised. That gives us 100 men against 300 or 400 Imperials with a main column approaching." "Those are not survivable numbers, Your Grace." "They are not comfortable numbers. Survivable is a different calculation." Kedrick turned to the assembled court. His voice cut through the panic like a blade through cloth. "Everyone in this hall moves to the inner keep immediately. Commander Theros will direct you. Anyone who attempts to leave the castle will be treated as an enemy combatant. There will be no further discussion." The nobles moved. Not because they agreed or because they were brave or because they believed in Kaedric's ability to save them. They moved because his voice carried the absolute authority of a man who had spent 20 years making disobedience synonymous with destruction, and in a moment of genuine crisis, even his enemies defaulted to obedience because the alternative required independent thought, and independent thought required courage they did not possess. Kaedric seized Seraphina's arm as the hall emptied around them. The catacombs beneath the east wing connect to a passage that exits beyond the castle walls. "Theros will take you." "No. This is not a negotiation." "You are right. It is not. Because I'm not leaving. The castle is breached. Imperial soldiers are inside the walls. Vivian's people opened the gates, which means the infiltration goes deeper than we knew, which means I cannot guarantee the safety of anyone inside Blackthorn, including myself." "Then do not guarantee it. I did not ask for guarantees. I asked to be treated as a person with the right to make her own decisions, and I am making one now. I stay." "You will die." "Maybe. But I will die having chosen. That is more than your mother got, more than your brothers got, more than Aldrin got." The words hit him like a fist to the sternum, not because they were cruel, because they were the most brutally compassionate thing anyone had ever said to him. A reminder that the choice to face destruction was itself a form of power that no amount of control could replicate. He released her arm. "Stay close to me," he said. "I plan to." They moved through the corridors of Blackthorn Castle together, and the castle was transforming around them. Servants fled through passageways. Guards took positions at choke points. The sound of steel on steel echoed from the southern courtyard. where the first wave of Imperial soldiers had engaged the garrison, and the sound was not distant or abstract. It was close and wet and punctuated by screaming. Kadric drew his sword as they descended toward the main corridor that connected the Great Hall to the inner keep. The blade was black steel, forged in Ravencroft's mountain foundries, and it felt in his hand the way it always felt, like a part of his body that he kept sheathed until the world reminded him why he needed it. They rounded a corner and met the war face to face. 8 Imperial soldiers had breached the inner corridor through a servant's entrance that should have been sealed. They were professional and disciplined, and they recognized the Duke of Blackthorn instantly, because every Imperial soldier had been briefed on what he looked like, and the briefing had included the instruction to take him alive if possible and dead if necessary. Kadric did not wait for them to decide which option they preferred. He moved into the first soldier before the man finished raising his shield, driving the black blade through the gap between breastplate and shoulder guard with the mechanical precision of someone who had been doing this since he was 17 years old and had never found a reason to stop. The soldier dropped. The second swung at Kadric's head. He ducked, stepped inside the arc, and put the blade through the man's throat. The third and fourth attacked simultaneously. Kadric caught one strike on his sword and took the other on his armored forearm, feeling the impact rattle through the bones of his wrist. And then Theros was beside him with 2 garrison soldiers, and the corridor became a compressed hell of metal and blood, and the ugly, intimate sounds of men trying to kill each other in a space too small for proper fighting. It lasted 90 seconds. When it ended, 8 Imperial soldiers lay on the stone floor and Kadric stood over them with blood on his hands, and his face, and the slow, heavy breathing of a man whose body had done what it was designed to do and was now processing the chemical aftermath. Seraphina stood behind him. She had not run. She had pressed herself against the wall and watched, and her face was the color of bleached linen, but her eyes were steady, and her hands, though shaking, were curled into fists rather than open in surrender. "We need to reach the inner keep," Theros said. "The garrison is holding the northern courtyard, but the south is lost. If the main Imperial column arrives before we consolidate, we lose the castle." "How long?" "Hours, maybe less." They moved. Through corridors littered with debris and bodies, and the acrid smoke of torches knocked from their brackets. Through the sound of fighting that echoed from every direction, disorienting and omnipresent, making the castle itself feel like a living thing in pain. Kadric's mind operated on 2 levels simultaneously. The surface level tracked immediate threats, spatial awareness, escape routes, enemy positions. But beneath that surface, beneath the combat reflexes, and the tactical calculations, something else was happening. Something tectonic. Vivienne's words in the Great Hall. "You are still the boy under the floor." He had rejected it when she said it, dismissed it as the final weapon of a defeated enemy, a psychological grenade thrown in desperation. But now, moving through his own castle while it burned and bled around him, fighting soldiers who had entered through gates that his own people had opened, he felt the truth of it settling into his bones with the weight of something he had been carrying for 20 years without ever looking at it directly. He was still the boy under the floor. Every army he had built, every wall he had raised, every rival he had crushed, every tax he had levied, every execution he had ordered was the boy under the floor trying to make the burning stop. And it had never stopped. It had never even diminished. He had simply built louder and higher and more brutally until the noise of his own power drowned out the sound of his mother begging. And now the walls were literally falling, and the noise was failing, and the boy was still there, still 14, still choking on smoke beneath a dead woman's body. The realization did not weaken him. That was the strange part. It did not slow his sword arm or cloud his judgment or introduce hesitation into his movements. It clarified. It burned away 20 years of accumulated justification and rationalization and left behind something he did not recognize. Not strength, not weakness. Something that existed in the space between the two. Something that had no name in the vocabulary of power that Caedric Vale had spent his life speaking. Something that felt, impossibly, like the beginning of an honest assessment of who he actually was. They reached the inner keep as the garrison's defensive line buckled. Theros organized the remaining loyal soldiers into a perimeter around the keep's entrance, while Caedric directed the noble families into the underground chambers designed to withstand siege conditions. The castle shook with the impact of a battering ram against the inner gate. Dust fell from the ceiling. Children cried. Lords who had spent their lives issuing commands from comfortable chairs now pressed themselves against stone walls and discovered that authority was a costume that came off very easily when the situation required genuine courage. Kadric stood at the entrance to the underground chambers and watched his world collapse with the detached clarity of a man observing his own autopsy. Theros appeared at his shoulder. "Your Grace, there is one option remaining. Tell me." "The catacombs. The same passage you wanted Seraphina to use. It leads beyond the walls to the northern forest. If we move now, with a small force, we can reach the mountain pass before the Imperial column blocks it. From there, we can regroup with the border garrisons, raise a counterforce, take the castle back. Abandon Blackthorn. Temporarily. I have never abandoned anything in my life." Then today you learn, because the alternative is dying in this keep, and the border garrisons cannot rally without you. Every soldier who is still loyal to Ravencroft is loyal to you, not to this building. The castle is stone. You are the duchy. Kadric's jaw tightened until the scar along its edge went white. Every instinct inside him, every lesson carved into his nervous system by trauma and survival, and 20 years of ruling through absolute refusal to yield, screamed against what Theros was suggesting. Leaving Blackthorn was not a tactical retreat. It was an admission that the walls he had built were not enough. That control was not enough. That the entire architecture of his life, constructed brick by brick from the ashes of his family's murder, could be breached and overrun and taken from him by the same forces he had spent his existence trying to outrun. You are still the boy under the floor, and the boy under the floor had survived by leaving, by crawling through smoke and debris and the bodies of people he loved and finding the one gap in the destruction that led to somewhere else. Somewhere that was not burning. The battering ram struck the inner gate again. The gate cracked. Seraphina appeared beside him. She did not speak. She did not need to. She stood there with her bruised throat and her steady eyes and her fists still curled at her sides, and her presence said everything that words could not. You can choose to die defending a symbol, or you can choose to live and become something the symbol never was. Kadric looked at his castle, at the walls he had rebuilt after the fire, at the throne he had occupied for 2 decades, at the great hall where his mother had once danced and his brothers had once laughed, and Vivienne Morcant had sat smiling for 7 years while the blood of his family dried beneath the foundations. Then he looked at Seraphina, and the boy under the floor made the only choice he had ever really known how to make. He chose to survive. Theros, the catacombs, now. They moved. 30 loyal soldiers, 12 noble families who chose to follow. Seraphina at Kadric's side. They descended into the ancient tunnels beneath Blackthorn Castle, while above them the inner gate finally shattered, and Imperial soldiers poured into the keep and found it empty. The catacombs were dark and cold and smelled of stone and centuries, and the particular kind of silence that exists in places where the living are not supposed to go. Kadric moved through them with a torch in one hand and his sword in the other, and with every step deeper into the earth he felt the architecture of the man he had been for 20 years peeling away like dead skin, leaving something raw and unfinished and terrifyingly alive underneath. He had lost Blackthorn, the castle, the throne, the symbol, the walls. He had lost everything he had built to replace the family that was taken from him, and the loss should have destroyed him the way the fire should have destroyed him 20 years ago, but it did not. Because somewhere between the Great Hall and the catacombs, between Vivienne's accusation and Seraphina's refusal to leave, between the sound of the battering ram and the silence of the tunnels, something inside Kadric Vale had shifted from its foundations. Not broken. Shifted. The way a bone shifts when it is reset after being badly healed for years. The pain is extraordinary, but the alignment afterward is true. They emerged from the catacombs into the northern forest as the first light of dawn bled through the trees. Behind them, Blackthorn Castle burned against the gray sky, smoke rising from its towers like the final breath of something ancient and exhausted. Kadric stood at the tree line and watched his castle burn, and felt the heat on his face and smelled the smoke and heard, beneath everything, beneath the crackle of flame and the distant shouts of Imperial soldiers and the quiet weeping of the nobles huddled in the forest behind him, the sound of a 14-year-old boy finally, after 20 years crawling out from under the floor. Serafina stood beside him. Her hand found his, not gently, firmly. The grip of a person who understood that what was burning behind them was not a castle. It was a cage. And ahead of them, through the frozen forest and the mountain passes and the border garrisons where Ravencroft's loyal armies waited for a duke who had never once asked for anything but obedience, lay the war that would determine whether Cedric Vale could become something he had never been. Not a conqueror, not a tyrant, not the boy under the floor, something new, something that had no name yet, something that required him to do the one thing his entire life had been constructed to prevent. Trust another human being with the parts of himself that the fire had not burned away. He squeezed Serafina's hand, and they walked into the forest together, toward the mountains, toward the war, toward the impossible and terrifying possibility that survival was not enough, had never been enough, and that the man who emerged from these trees would either be someone worth following or no one at all. Behind them, Blackthorn burned. Ahead of them, the Empire waited. And somewhere between the two, in the frozen silence of the northern woods, Cedric Vale took the first step of a journey that began not with power or fury or the cold machinery of control, but with the warmth of a hand holding his and the unbearable, revolutionary act of letting it. They walked for 3 days through frozen forest that wanted them dead. The northern woods of Ravencroft were not the kind of wilderness that appeared in paintings or pastoral poetry. They were dense, black-trunked, ancient growth that blocked sunlight so completely the forest floor existed in permanent twilight even at noon. The snow here was not the black ash-tainted fall that covered the duchy's lowlands. It was white and deep and merciless, reaching past the knees of grown men, swallowing the legs of children, turning every step into an act of calculated endurance that drained the body faster than cold or hunger. Cedric led from the front because he did not know how to lead from anywhere else. 30 soldiers, 12 noble families, 47 civilians including servants and children who had followed the Duke into the catacombs because the alternative was imperial custody. And imperial custody in wartime meant interrogation rooms and shallow graves. Nearly 100 people moving through terrain that punished movement, eating rations meant for 30, sleeping in shifts beneath trees so thick with ice that their branches cracked in the night like bones breaking. On the first day, Cedric spoke to no one except Theros. His mind operated in the narrow band of tactical calculation that had sustained him through every crisis of his adult life. Distance to the border garrison at Ironfell, estimated imperial pursuit timeline, supply mathematics, caloric deficit per person per mile. The numbers were bad. The numbers were always bad in retreat, but numbers were controllable, and controllable things did not frighten him. On the second day, a child died. She was 4 years old, the daughter of a minor lord's cook, a woman who had grabbed the girl and run when the gates broke because running was the only option available, and the catacombs were closer than the kitchens. The child had been coughing since they entered the forest. By the second morning, the cough had become a wet, rasping thing that sounded like cloth tearing inside her chest. And by noon she stopped coughing entirely because her body had decided that breathing was sufficient effort without the additional labor of clearing her lungs. They found her still in her mother's arms at the midday rest. Blue lips. Closed eyes. A face so small that Cedric could have covered it entirely with one hand. The mother did not scream. She sat in the snow holding the body and rocking and making a sound that was not crying and not speaking and not anything that had a name in any language Cedric knew. It was the sound of a human being processing a loss so total that the machinery of expression simply failed, leaving behind a raw, formless noise that came from somewhere below thought or feeling or sanity. Cedric stood over them and felt something split open inside his chest. Not grief. He had armored himself against grief so thoroughly that the emotion could not penetrate in its pure form. What he felt instead was the collision between the thing he had always told himself about power and the thing that was standing in front of him in the snow. He had built Ravencroft on the principle that strength protected, that walls and armies and absolute control created a perimeter inside which the people under his authority could survive. And here was a 4-year-old girl who had been inside his walls, inside his castle, under his protection, and she was dead because his walls had failed, and his protection was a theory that could not keep a child's lungs working in a frozen forest. He knelt in the snow beside the mother. He did not speak. He did not offer comfort because he did not possess comfort in any form he knew how to deliver. He knelt there in silence while the column waited and the cold pressed in from every direction, and he stayed until Theros touched his shoulder and said, "Your Grace, we need to move." They buried the child beneath a tree that Kaedric marked with his knife. 3 cuts in the bark, a symbol that meant nothing to anyone except a mother who would never return to this place and a duke who would never forget it. They moved. On the 3rd day, Serafina walked beside him for the first time since they had entered the forest. She had spent the previous 2 days at the rear of the column, helping the weaker civilians, distributing rations, carrying a child on her hip when its father's legs gave out in the deep snow. She had not spoken to Kaedric, not out of anger or resentment, out of the practical understanding that a duke leading a retreat through hostile territory needed his attention undivided, and her presence at his side created a distraction that the situation could not afford. But on the 3rd day, she appeared beside him at dawn and matched his pace without comment, and they walked together through the frozen twilight in a silence that was not empty but full, loaded with everything they had not said and could not say, and might never get the chance to say if the next 72 hours went the way the numbers suggested they would. After an hour, she spoke. "The border garrison? How many men?" 800 at full strength. Ironfell has been reinforced since the autumn because of raider activity on the northern frontier. Will they fight for you? Colonel Marin commands Ironfell. She has served Ravencroft since before I took the duchy. Her loyalty is not theoretical. Everything is theoretical until it is tested. He looked at her. The cold had stripped the color from her face and cracked her lips and turned her breath into clouds that dissolved against the gray air like small surrenders. She looked exhausted and underfed and entirely, stubbornly alive. "You sound like Theros," he said. "Theros is usually right. Do not tell him that. He is insufferable enough." The faintest ghost of something that was not quite a smile crossed her face. It lasted less than a second, but Kaedric saw it, and the scene of it produced a sensation in his chest that he catalogued with the bewildered precision of a man encountering a species he did not know existed. Warmth. Not temperature. Emotional warmth. The kind that lives in the space between 2 people who are walking through a frozen forest toward probable death and find, against all reason and evidence, that the presence of the other makes the walking bearable. He had never felt it before. Not once in 34 years. And the novelty of it frightened him more than the Imperial army at his back. They reached the tree line above Ironfell at dusk on the 3rd day. The border garrison occupied a natural fortress carved into the base of the Ashfall Mountains, a complex of stone buildings and defensive walls that had been built and rebuilt over centuries to guard the northern pass against invasion. Torchlight flickered along its battlements. Smoke rose from its barracks. The banner of Ravencroft, black and silver, flew from its highest tower. Kaedric stopped at the tree line and studied the garrison the way he studied everything, with suspicion. "Theros, send a scout." "Your Grace, Colonel Marin is loyal. We have confirmed her position multiple times." Vivian was loyal. Brennan was loyal. The steward who altered the guard rotation 20 years ago was loyal. Loyalty is a word people use until a better offer arrives. Send a scout. Theros sent a scout. The man returned 40 minutes later, breathless and half-frozen, with news that Colonel Marin was alive. The garrison was intact, and a raven had arrived from the south 3 days ago bearing an imperial order to arrest the Duke of Blackthorn on sight. "And," Kaedric said, "Colonel Marin used the order to light her fireplace, Your Grace." Something shifted in Kaedric's expression. Not relief, not gratitude. Something closer to the feeling of a man testing a floor he expected to collapse and finding, against experience, that it held. Move the column. Full approach. No concealment. They walked out of the tree line toward the garrison in the open, 100 frozen, exhausted people moving across the snow plain like a procession of ghosts returning from somewhere the living were not supposed to go. The garrison sentries spotted them immediately. Warning horns sounded. Gates opened. And Colonel Marin herself appeared at the entrance in full military dress, a woman in her 50s with iron-gray hair cropped close to her skull, and the bearing of someone who had been guarding the Empire's most dangerous frontier for 30 years, and considered everything south of the mountains to be someone else's problem. Your Grace, she said as Kadric reached the gate. You look like hell. I have been through it. I heard. The Ravens have been busy. Imperial order for your arrest. Halloween's forces occupying Blackthorn. The Emperor declaring Ravencroft a rebel territory. She paused. And something about you carrying a woman out of the Imperial Palace in front of 300 witnesses. 400. Must have been quite a party. Colonel, I need your garrison. You have it. You have had it since the day you gave me this command and told me to hold the line no matter what came from either side of these mountains. The Empire can send whatever orders it wants. Paper does not hold a frontier, soldiers do, and my soldiers answer to Ravencroft. The Empire will brand you a traitor. They can brand me whatever they like. Brands are for cattle. I am a colonel. Kedrick felt the floor hold again. Solid, unyielding. The first foundation he had trusted in weeks that did not crack beneath his weight. They entered the garrison, and the gates closed behind them, and for the first time since the bells had erupted in Blackthorn Castle, the 100 people who had followed the Duke into the forest stopped moving and allowed their bodies to register what they had survived. Some collapsed. Some wept. Some stood motionless in the courtyard and stared at the walls around them with the blank, overwhelmed expression of people who had forgotten what safety felt like and needed time to remember. Kedrick did not rest. He stood in the garrison's war room with Theros and Colonel Marin within the hour, studying maps of the region with the focused intensity of a man converting pain into planning. The Imperial main column will consolidate at Blackthorn before marching north, Theros said. Standard doctrine. Secure the capital, establish supply lines, then push to the frontier. That gives us 2 weeks before they reach Ironfell. They will not reach Ironfell, Kadrick said. Marin raised an eyebrow. We have 800 soldiers, Your Grace. Even with your 30, we are looking at 830 against an Imperial force that will number 5,000 by the time it consolidates. We are not fighting 5,000 soldiers. We are fighting the Emperor's confidence. Adrian sent an advance force through the southern gate because he believed Blackthorn would fall quickly. It did. That success will make him overconfident, and overconfident armies extend their supply lines and underestimate mountain warfare. You want to fight them in the passes. I want to destroy them in the passes. The Grey March corridor is 7 miles of narrow terrain between vertical rock faces. An army of 5,000 entering that corridor becomes an army of 200, because only 200 men can stand abreast in that space at any given time. Their numbers become irrelevant. Their cavalry becomes irrelevant. Their siege equipment becomes dead weight. And their archers cannot shoot what they cannot see. The mountain fog in Grey March is so thick this time of year that visibility drops to 30 feet after midday. We hit them at fog break, ambush positions along the upper ridgeline, rolling attacks, strike, withdraw, strike again. They will not know how many soldiers they are fighting or where the next attack comes from. Marin studied the map. Her finger traced the Grey March corridor, the narrow channel between 2 mountain walls that had been the graveyard of invading armies for centuries. The strategy was sound. It was more than sound. It was the kind of asymmetric warfare that Cadric Vale had built his reputation on, the doctrine that had made Ravencroft untouchable for 2 decades. It requires them to enter the corridor, Marin said. If their generals have any sense, they will bypass Grey March and approach through the western foothills. They will not, because we are going to make sure they come through the corridor. How? Bait. Theros looked at Cadric. He recognized the tone, the flat, almost casual register that the Duke used when he was about to propose something that would make everyone in the room uncomfortable. What kind of bait, Your Grace? Me. The word landed in the war room like a stone in still water. I will ride to the mouth of the Grey March corridor with a force of 50 men, visible, unmistakable. The Duke of Blackthorn sitting in the open, waiting. The Imperial commanders will see an opportunity to end the war in a single engagement. They will send their main force through the corridor to take me. And then they will be inside the kill zone, Marin said. And then they will be inside the kill zone. Your Grace, you are proposing to use yourself as bait against 5,000 Imperial soldiers. I'm proposing to stand in front of 5,000 Imperial soldiers and remind them why they were afraid of me in the first place. Theros exhaled through his nose. If the timing fails, if the ambush positions are not set, If the fog does not hold, you die. If I hide behind these walls and wait for a siege I cannot win, everyone dies. The mathematics are not complicated, Theros. The mathematics of your survival are very complicated, Your Grace, because without you there is no Ravencroft. Not the castle, not the territory. You. If you die in that corridor, every soldier in this garrison and every civilian who followed you through that forest loses the one thing keeping them from imperial execution. Then I will not die. That is not a strategy. That is stubbornness. Stubbornness is the only strategy I have ever had. It has worked so far. Merrin looked at Theros. Theros looked at the map. The silence in the war room was the kind of silence that precedes irreversible decisions, the held breath moment when the weight of a choice becomes so heavy that it bends the air around it. Colonel, Kadric said, can your soldiers hold the ambush positions? My soldiers can hold anything. Theros, can you coordinate the rolling attack pattern? I have coordinated every engagement you have fought for 11 years, Your Grace, including the ones you neglected to inform me about in advance. Then we move at dawn. 2 days to reach Grey March, 1 day to set positions, and then we wait for the Emperor to make the last mistake of his campaign. The war room cleared. Plans became orders. Orders became movement. 800 soldiers who had spent months guarding a quiet frontier suddenly found themselves preparing for the engagement that would determine whether Ravencroft survived or became a footnote in the Empire's history of conquered territories. Kedrick found Seraphina in the garrison's small medical ward, helping the physician treat frostbite among the civilian refugees. Her hands were steady as she applied poultices to blackened fingers and swollen feet, moving from patient to patient with the quiet efficiency of a woman who had decided that usefulness was a more productive response to fear than paralysis. He stood in the doorway and watched her for several minutes before she noticed him. "You are staring," she said without looking up. "I am observing. There is no difference when you do it." He crossed the room and sat on an empty cot across from her. The medical ward smelled of pine resin and wool, and the sharp mineral tang of the salves the physician used for cold injuries. It was warm. It was the first truly warm room Caedric had been in since leaving Blackthorn, and the heat against his skin produced a sensation so overwhelming that he had to concentrate to keep his breathing regular. "I am riding to Greymarch in the morning," he said. Her hand stopped moving on the bandage she was wrapping. She did not look up. She finished the wrap, tied it, and then raised her eyes to his. "As bait. Theros told you." "Theros did not need to tell me. I have watched you for weeks. You do not make plans that put other people in front of you. You make plans that put you in front of everything. It is effective. It is suicidal. Those are frequently the same thing in my experience." "Then your experience is something we need to discuss." He almost smiled. The muscles around his mouth engaged in the preliminary movements of an expression he had not used in so long that the neural pathways had nearly atrophied, and the sensation was strange, like trying to speak a language he had learned as a child and forgotten. "I'm not planning to die, Seraphina." Nobody plans to die. They plan to win and accept death as a tolerable alternative. That is not the same thing as wanting to live. The distinction hit him with the force of a physical blow, because she was right. He had spent 20 years accepting death as a tolerable alternative. Every battle he had fought, every risk he had taken, every moment of violence he had walked into with his jaw set and his sword drawn had been underwritten by the implicit understanding that dying was not the worst outcome. The worst outcome was losing control. The worst outcome was being helpless. The worst outcome was being 14 again, under the floor, listening to people die while he did nothing. Death was preferable to that. Death had always been preferable to that. But standing in this warm room, watching this woman wrap bandages around the damaged hands of people who had followed him into a frozen forest because they believed he could save them, Kedrick felt the calculus shift. He wanted to live, not survive. Live. The distinction was new and enormous, and it terrified him in a way that imperial armies and burning castles and 20 years of assassination attempts had never managed. "Come back," she said. "That is not a request." Seraphina. Come back from that corridor, alive, complete. Not a symbol and not a weapon and not a strategy. Come back as the man who sat in a chair outside my door all night because he did not know how to say he was afraid of losing something. Come back as that man. He is worth more than every castle in this empire. The words entered him through the cracks in the architecture that Vivian's betrayal and the forest and the dead child and the burning of Blackthorn had opened over the past week, and they settled into the spaces where the old structure had been and began, quietly and without permission, to build something new. He reached across the space between the cots and took her hand, not the way he had taken it in the imperial ballroom, not with possession, not with the blind, territorial instinct that had started a war and cost him his castle and driven 100 people through a frozen forest. He took it the way a man takes a hand when he is standing at the edge of something he cannot see the bottom of and needs to know that another human being is standing there with him. "I will come back," he said. "Promise me." "I do not make promises. Promises are debts, and debts are vulnerabilities." "Then be vulnerable. For once in your life, be vulnerable on purpose." He looked at their hands, his scarred and rough and calloused from decades of sword work and hard use, hers smaller but no less marked, the hands of a woman who had bandaged wounds and carried children and gripped kitchen knives in the dark. "I promise," he said. The word felt like jumping off a cliff. No certainty of landing, no guarantee of survival, just the act itself, the leap. She squeezed his hand once and let go. He stood, walked to the door, stopped. "When this is over," he said, "when the war is finished and the empire is dealt with and Blackthorn is rebuilt, I'm going to ask you something." "What?" "I do not know yet. I have never asked anyone anything. I will need to figure out the words." "I will wait." He left the medical ward and walked through the garrison toward the armory where his black steel blade waited, and his soldiers were preparing for a march that would take them to the mouth of a mountain corridor, where 800 men would face 5,000, and the Duke of Blackthorn would stand in the open like a beacon lit for his own destruction. Dawn came cold and white and absolute. 50 riders assembled in the garrison courtyard. Kedrick mounted a black warhorse that Colonel Marin had provided from the garrison stable, a massive, ill-tempered animal that suited its rider in disposition, if not in patience. Theros rode beside him. Behind them, the 50 men who had volunteered for bait duty sat their horses with the rigid calm of soldiers who had made their peace with probability and decided to ride anyway. The garrison gates opened. Kedrick looked back once. Seraphina stood on the battlement above the gate, watching. The wind caught her hair, and the early light caught her face, and she looked, in that moment, like something worth every castle he had lost and every wall he would never rebuild. He raised his hand. Not a wave, not a salute. A gesture that contained everything he could not say, because the language of vulnerability was still new to him, and the vocabulary was limited, and the grammar was improvised, and the only fluency he had was in the gesture itself. The open hand. The acknowledgement that the person standing on that wall mattered more than the outcome of the battle he was riding toward. She raised hers in return. He turned the horse and rode through the gates. They reached the mouth of the Grey March corridor at midnight on the second day. The corridor stretched before them like a wound in the earth. 7 miles of narrow passage between vertical rock walls that rose 300 feet on either side, creating a channel so deep and narrow that sunlight reached the floor for only 2 hours a day. The rock was black granite streaked with veins of iron ore that bled rust-colored stains down the walls like old wounds that had never healed. The ground was frozen mud and loose stone and the bones of armies that had tried to force this passage over centuries and failed. Kedrick dismounted and stood at the entrance and felt the corridor breathing. Cold air flowing through it like exhalation from something massive and sleeping and indifferent to the small violent dramas that humans enacted between its walls. "Positions?" he asked. Theros consulted with the advanced scouts. Marin's forces are set along the upper ridgeline, 300 on the east wall, 300 on the west, 200 held in reserve at the northern exit. Ambush points established at mile markers 2, 4, and 6. The fog? Building. Mountain weather stations confirm heavy fog formation beginning at dawn. By midday, visibility in the corridor will be under 40 feet. And the Imperials? Scouts report the main column broke camp this morning, 5,000 infantry, 200 cavalry. Siege equipment slowing their march. They will reach the corridor entrance by late afternoon tomorrow. Then we have 16 hours. Kadric looked at the 50 men who would stand with him at the corridor entrance. 50 against 5,000. The numbers were absurd. The numbers were designed to be absurd, because absurdity was the point. No rational commander would place 50 men in the open against an army of that size unless those 50 men were a trap, and the imperial generals would know this, and they would hesitate. And then they would look at the Duke of Blackthorn sitting on his horse at the mouth of the corridor with his banner flying, and they would calculate that capturing or killing him was worth the risk of any trap, because ending Caedric Vale ended the war. They would be right about the value. They would be wrong about the risk. The night passed in the particular silence that precedes battle. Not quiet. The wind howled through the corridor, and the horses stamped and the soldiers checked their equipment with the repetitive, ritualistic precision of men preparing their bodies and their tools for an event that would demand everything from both. But beneath the noise, beneath the wind and the movement, and the mechanical sounds of preparation, there was a silence that lived in the spaces between heartbeats and the gaps between breaths. A silence made of anticipation and fear, and the crystalline awareness that the next 24 hours would determine whether you continued existing or became a story that other people told. Kadric did not sleep. He sat on a flat rock at the corridor entrance with his sword across his knees, the same posture he had held outside Seraphina's door, and he stared into the darkness of the passage ahead and thought about the boy under the floor. For 20 years he had been running from that boy, building walls and raising armies and crushing enemies and accumulating power in quantities so vast that the boy's terror should have been buried beneath it all, unreachable, sealed away in the foundations of an empire of control. And now the empire was burning and the walls were down and the armies were scattered and the terror was still there, still 14 years old, still choking on smoke, still listening to his mother's voice go silent. But something else was there now too. A hand holding his in a medical ward. A voice saying, "Come back." A promise made not from strength, but from the terrifying voluntary act of admitting that strength was not enough and had never been enough, and that the man who rode to war in the morning needed to be someone different from the man who had ridden to every war before. Not less dangerous, not less capable, not less willing to kill and die and do whatever the corridor demanded, but fighting for something different, not control, not possession. Not the frozen architecture of a man who had replaced love with authority because love could be taken and authority could be enforced, fighting to come back, to keep a promise, to be the man a woman on a battlement had raised her hand toward, not the duke, not the title, not the symbol, but the man underneath all of it who had been buried for 20 years and was only now, at the mouth of a killing corridor with dawn approaching and an army on the horizon, beginning to breathe. Dawn came. The fog rose. And through the mist from the south came the sound that every soldier in the Grey March corridor had been waiting for. The low, rhythmic thunder of 5,000 boots striking frozen ground in unison. The creak of siege equipment. The jangle of cavalry harness. The sound of an empire coming to crush the last duke standing between it and total dominion. Kadric mounted his horse. The 50 men formed a line across the corridor entrance. Shoulder to shoulder, shields up. A wall of flesh and steel and deliberate, calculated defiance that was designed not to win, but to be seen. The Imperial vanguard appeared through the fog. 200 men in formation, shields locked, moving with the professional discipline of soldiers who had conquered provinces and expected to conquer this one. Behind them, the main column stretched into the mist like a serpent whose tail was invisible and whose length was incalculable. The vanguard stopped 300 yards from Caedric's line. A rider emerged from the formation, an imperial officer in ceremonial armor bearing the emperor's standard. He rode forward until he was close enough for Caedric to see his face, a young face, clean-shaven, carrying the expression of a man who had been given the honor of delivering an ultimatum to the most feared duke in the empire and was trying very hard to look like the honor did not terrify him. Duke Caedric Vale of Blackthorn, by order of Emperor Adrian, you are commanded to surrender yourself and your forces immediately. Your lands are forfeit. Your titles are revoked. Resistance will be met with total military response. Caedric sat his horse in the center of the line and looked at the officer the way he had looked at 1,000 men who had come to him with demands and threats and ultimatums over 20 years. With the patient, measured attention of a man who was already 3 moves ahead and waiting for the rest of the board to catch up. "Tell your emperor something for me," Kedrick said. His voice carried through the fog with the clarity of a blade drawn from its sheath. "Tell him I lost my castle. I lost my throne. I lost every wall I ever built. And I am still here. Still standing, still looking at his army without flinching. Tell him that whatever he sends through this corridor is not coming out the other side. And tell him that the man he is trying to destroy died in Blackthorn Castle a week ago." The officer's horse shifted nervously. "Your Grace, the Emperor's terms are not negotiable." "Neither am I." He drew his sword. 50 men drew theirs. And behind the Imperial vanguard, 5,000 soldiers began to pour into the Grey March corridor like water into a funnel. And above them, hidden in the fog along the ridgeline, 800 soldiers of Ravencroft waited with arrows nocked and rocks positioned, and the cold, professional patience of a garrison that had been guarding the most dangerous frontier in the Empire for 30 years and had never once been given the chance to prove why. The officer retreated. The vanguard advanced. Kedrick raised his sword above his head, and the corridor erupted. Arrows fell from the fog like black rain. Boulders crashed from the ridgeline into the packed Imperial formation with impacts that sounded like the world breaking. The vanguard shattered under the first volley. Men screamed. Horses panicked. The narrow corridor turned their numbers from advantage into trap. Bodies pressing against bodies with nowhere to retreat because the main column was still pushing forward from behind, 5,000 soldiers compressing into a space designed for 200, the mathematics of geography overruling the mathematics of force. Kedrick charged, 50 men into the chaos, into the smoke and the fog and the screaming and the collapse. His black blade opened the first Imperial soldier from shoulder to hip. The second fell to a backhand strike that caught the gap between helmet and neck guard. The third locked shields with Theros and Kaedric, hit the shield with enough force to drive the man backward into the soldiers behind him, creating a ripple of compressed bodies that turned organized formation into stumbling, tangled vulnerability. The corridor became a machine of destruction, every ambush point fired in sequence. Mile 2, Mile 4, Mile 6. The Imperial column, stretched along 7 miles of narrow passage, could not see the attacks coming through the fog and could not communicate between its sections because the rock walls blocked signal horns and the screaming drowned out shouted commands. Units fought independently, confused, blind, dying. Kedrick fought at the corridor entrance for what felt like hours and was probably 40 minutes. His arms burned. His hands bled inside his gloves where the sword grip had worn through leather and skin. A pike grazed his ribs and opened a cut that soaked his side with warmth that turned cold almost instantly in the mountain air. He did not stop. Stopping was not a concept that existed in the vocabulary of a man who had survived by refusing to stop. But for the first time in his life, the refusal was not powered by terror or rage or the frozen machinery of control. It was powered by a promise. "Come back." The words lived in his chest cavity beside the pain and the exertion and the hammering of his heart, and they burned there with a heat that the mountain cold could not touch. And every time his sword arm faltered or his vision blurred or his body screamed that the cost of continuing was more than flesh could sustain, the words ignited again, and his arm steadied, and his vision cleared, and his body found reserves that should not have existed because the body does not know its own limits until the mind gives it a reason to exceed them. By midday, the Imperial advance had stalled. By afternoon, the retreat began. 5,000 soldiers tried to withdraw through a 7-mile corridor while 800 attackers rained death from invisible positions above them, and the retreat became a rout. And the rout became a catastrophe. And the catastrophe became the kind of military disaster that would be studied in war academies for generations. Kaedric sat his horse at the corridor entrance, covered in blood that was mostly not his, and watched the Imperial army collapse into itself. His chest heaved. The cut along his ribs had soaked through his armor and left a trail of red droplets in the snow behind him. His sword arm hung at his side, trembling with the fine motor tremor of muscles that had been pushed beyond their engineering specifications. Theros appeared beside him, blood on his face, a cut above his eye, breathing hard but upright. "Your Grace, they are breaking." "I see it." "Marin reports the reserve force has sealed the southern exit." The Imperial rear guard is trapped between our ridgeline positions and the blocked corridor. We have them. Kaedric looked at the fog-filled corridor where the sounds of a dying army echoed between the rock walls. Screaming, steel, the thunder of falling stone. The sound of 5,000 men learning, in the most brutal classroom available, that the Duke of Blackthorn had not been defeated when they took his castle. He had been released. Then a rider burst from the fog at the corridor entrance, a garrison scout on a lathered horse, screaming words that cut through the sound of battle like a blade through silk. Your Grace, Ironfell is under attack, a second Imperial force, 2,000 cavalry. They bypassed the mountains through the western foothills. They hit the garrison an hour ago. Kaedric's blood stopped moving. Ironfell, the garrison, the civilians, the noble families. Seraphina. How? Theros said. Our scouts covered the western approach. They came through Ashenmere territory, Commander. Lord Halloween negotiated passage. The cavalry moved at night through terrain our scouts were not monitoring because Ashenmere was supposed to be neutral. Supposed to be neutral. 3 words that contain the entire history of political betrayal, compressed into a single lesson that Kaedric had learned and forgotten and was now learning again with the kind of clarity that only comes when the thing being threatened is no longer a castle or a territory or a symbol, but a person whose hand you held in a medical ward while promising to come back alive. He turned his horse south. Theros, finish the corridor. Take every man who can still ride. Your Grace, you cannot reach Ironfell in time. 2,000 cavalry against a garrison already depleted by our deployment here. The numbers are impossible. I have been hearing that word all week. It has not stopped me yet. Kaedric. The use of his name, not his title, stopped him. Theros had used his given name exactly 3 times in 11 years. Once when they were surrounded at the Battle of Ashfall Ridge. Once when the assassination attempt in the East Wing had come within 6 inches of his throat. And now. You promised someone you would come back alive, Theros said. Riding into 2,000 cavalry alone is not coming back alive. It is choosing a more dramatic way to die. Kaedric looked at his commander. 11 years of shared blood and shared silence and the particular kind of loyalty that exists between men who have repeatedly decided not to let each other die. Then ride with me, he said. Theros stared at him for 3 seconds. Then he turned his horse. All mounted soldiers, on me. Now! 30 riders formed behind them. 30 men on exhausted horses, bleeding and battered and running on the fumes of adrenaline and the irrational, unquantifiable conviction that the man they followed was worth following into one more impossible situation. Kaedric drove his heels into the warhorse's flanks, and 31 riders exploded from the Grey March corridor into the open snow plain, riding south toward Ironfell, toward a garrison under siege, toward a woman standing on a battlement who had asked him to come back and to whom he had made the first promise of his life. The mountains blurred past. The snow flew. The sound of hooves on frozen ground was the sound of a man racing his own heartbeat toward the one outcome he could not survive losing. And somewhere ahead, through the snow and the failing light and the smoke rising from a garrison that was already burning, the war waited for its final answer. The smoke from Ironfell rose against the twilight sky like a black pillar holding up the darkness, and Kaedric drove his horse toward it with the single-minded ferocity of a man who had finally discovered the one thing in his life that mattered more than survival. 31 riders crossed the snow plain at a gallop that killed 3 horses before they reached the foothills. The animals simply collapsed mid-stride, hearts bursting from the sustained effort of carrying armored men across frozen terrain at speeds their bodies were never designed to maintain. The riders hit the ground, rolled, and were pulled onto the backs of other horses without the column breaking stride, because stopping was not something any of them were willing to discuss. Kaedric rode at the front. His ribs screamed where the pike wound had reopened during the corridor battle, soaking his left side with blood that had frozen into a dark crust against his armor. His hands were numb inside his gloves. His vision had narrowed to a tunnel focused exclusively on the smoke ahead, and inside that tunnel, his mind ran a single calculation on an infinite loop. Distance, speed, time. Whether the numbers added up to a woman still alive on a battlement or a body in the rubble of a garrison that had been standing 12 hours ago. The numbers did not add up. He rode anyway, They crested the final ridge above Ironfell as full darkness fell, and what Cedric saw below stopped the breath in his chest, the way a fist stops a heartbeat. The garrison was not destroyed, it was fighting. The outer wall had been breached in 2 places. Imperial cavalry had poured through the gaps and occupied the southern courtyard, and the fighting there was savage, close quarters, the kind of combat that horses were useless for and that dismounted cavalry hated because it stripped away their primary advantage and forced them to fight as infantry against soldiers who had been training as infantry their entire careers. Colonel Marin's remaining garrison forces had fallen back to the inner keep and formed a defensive perimeter that was holding. Barely. The perimeter was a crescent of shields and spears across the keep's entrance, bowed inward under the pressure of repeated cavalry charges, bending but refusing to break with the stubborn, bloody-minded resilience of soldiers who had decided that this particular piece of ground was worth dying on. And on the battlement above the keep's entrance, visible even from the ridge in the light of the fires burning throughout the garrison, a figure stood directing the defense. Serafina. She was not hiding. She was not sheltering in the underground chambers where the civilians had been evacuated. She was standing on the wall with a bow she had clearly taken from a fallen soldier, and she was using it with the imprecise but persistent determination of a woman who had never been trained in archery but understood the fundamental principle that arrows going in the direction of the enemy were better than no arrows at all. Something inside Cedric's chest unlocked. Not relief. Not yet. Relief was a luxury that came after survival, and survival was still an open question. What unlocked was something older and more fundamental, the recognition that the woman he had ridden across a frozen plain to reach was not waiting to be saved. She was fighting. She had always been fighting. From the moment she walked into his great hall in silver silk with her chin level and her eyes forward, she had been fighting, and the fact that she was still fighting now, on a burning battlement with a stolen bow and no training and an imperial army below her, was not surprising. It was inevitable. He had fallen in love with the inevitable. "Theros," he said, "wedge formation, through the southern breach, hit the cavalry from behind. 30 men against 2,000, Your Grace. 30 men they do not know are coming. Surprise changes arithmetic. Surprise changes the first 30 seconds. After that, arithmetic resumes. Then we make the first 30 seconds count." Theros looked at the garrison below, looked at the fires, looked at the battlement where a woman with a stolen bow was shooting arrows into an army. Then he looked at his duke, blood-soaked and half-frozen and burning with something that Theros had never seen in 11 years of service. Something that was not rage and not calculation and not the cold mechanical certainty that had driven every decision Cedric Vale had ever made. It was love. Stripped of pretense, stripped of possession, stripped of every defense mechanism that Cedric had wrapped around his capacity for human connection since the night his family burned. Raw, unarmored, terrifying love. The kind that makes a man ride through darkness toward fire, because the alternative is a world in which the fire consumes the only person who ever made him want to be more than what the fire had created. "Wedge formation," Theros said. "Through the breach, on the Duke's signal." 31 riders formed the wedge, Cedric at the point, Theros at his right shoulder. The rest fanning out behind in the compressed arrow-shaped formation designed to penetrate massed forces through concentrated momentum. They descended the ridge at a walk, then a trot, then a canter. Then, as the slope leveled and the southern breach opened before them like a wound in the garrison wall, a full gallop. Cedric hit the first line of Imperial cavalry from behind at a speed that turned horse and rider into a battering ram of flesh and steel. The impact was catastrophic. Dismounted cavalrymen who had been pressing toward the inner keep suddenly found themselves attacked from the rear by a force they had no intelligence about, no preparation for, and no tactical response to, because every ounce of their command structure's attention had been focused on breaking through Marin's defensive perimeter. The first 30 seconds were exactly what Cedric had promised. Chaos. His black blade carved through the Imperial rear guard with the accumulated fury of a man who had fought through a mountain corridor, ridden across a frozen plain on a dying horse, and arrived at the burning remnants of the last place in the world where someone was waiting for him. He did not fight with technique. He fought with the raw, ungovernable energy of a human being operating beyond the limits of what his body was designed to sustain, fueled by adrenaline and blood loss, and the absolute refusal to stop while the battlemen above him still held a figure with a bow. The Imperials wavered. They did not break. 2,000 men do not break because 30 hit them from behind, but they wavered the way a wall wavers when a crack appears in its foundation, and that waver created a momentary gap in the pressure on Marin's perimeter. And Marin, because she was a 30-year veteran who recognized opportunity the way a wolf recognizes an exposed throat, drove her garrison forward through the gap with everything she had left. The courtyard became a grinding, desperate two-front battle that lasted 3 hours. 3 hours of steel and blood and the sounds that human beings make when they are trying to kill each other in firelight. 3 hours of Kaedric fighting at the center of a collapsing formation, his 30 riders reduced to 20, then 15, then 11, each loss a subtraction that the already impossible mathematics could not absorb. 3 hours of Marin's garrison pushing forward foot by foot, shield by shield, reclaiming ground with the grinding patience of soldiers who understood that this was not a battle of momentum, but a battle of endurance. And endurance was the one resource that the defenders of Ironfell possessed in greater supply than their attackers. Because the Imperial cavalry had ridden hard to reach the garrison. They were tired. Their horses were blown. Their supply lines were non-existent because Halloween's arrangement with Ashenmere had covered passage, not logistics, and 2,000 men fighting on empty stomachs in unfamiliar terrain against a fortified position manned by soldiers who had been eating garrison rations and sleeping in garrison bunks. Discover very quickly that numerical superiority is a theoretical concept and exhaustion is a practical one. By midnight, the Imperial commander ordered withdrawal. The retreat was ugly, disorganized. Imperial cavalry streaming through the breaches in the wall they had created hours earlier, leaving behind their dead and their wounded and the wreckage of an assault that had come within 100 yards of succeeding before 31 riders on dying horses had appeared from the darkness like something the Empire's generals would spend years trying to explain. Kaedric did not pursue. He sat his horse in the burning courtyard, sword hanging from a hand that no longer had the strength to raise it, and watched the Imperials disappear into the night with the exhausted, empty-eyed stare of a man whose body had finally reached the absolute boundary of what it could do and was now operating on nothing except the electrical impulse that kept his heart beating and his lungs expanding. The cut along his ribs had opened fully. Blood ran down his left leg and into his boot and pooled on the cobblestones beneath his horse. A second wound, a sword cut across his left forearm that he did not remember receiving, had bled through his glove and turned his hand the color of rust. His vision was graying at the edges. The tunnel was closing. "Your Grace," Theros was beside him, also bleeding, also barely upright. "It is over." Kaedric looked at the battlement. Seraphina was still there. The bow hung from her hand. Her face was lit by the fires below, and she was looking down at him with an expression that contained everything the last 3 weeks had built between them. Fear and fury and exhaustion, and something that lived beneath all of those things, something that had no name in any language spoken by dukes or soldiers or the architects of empires. She dropped the bow. She disappeared from the battlement. 30 seconds later, the keep door opened and she ran across the courtyard, and Kaedric tried to dismount, and his body finally informed him that it was done, that the account was overdrawn, and the reserves were depleted, and the biological machinery that had kept him functioning for the last 36 hours was shutting down whether he approved or not. He fell from the horse. She caught him. Not gracefully. Not the way catches happen in stories told by people who have never caught a falling body. She caught him badly, his weight driving her backward, her knees buckling, both of them going down on the frozen cobblestones in a tangle of armor and blood and limbs that were no longer capable of coordinated movement. She ended up on her back with his head against her chest and his blood soaking through her clothes and his breathing so shallow that for 3 terrible seconds she could not tell if he was breathing at all. Kaedric. His eyes were closed. The scar along his jaw stood white against skin that had gone the color of candle wax. His lips moved without sound. "Kaedric, open your eyes." He opened them. The gray-blue irises were unfocused, dilated, the eyes of a man looking at something that was not quite in the room. "I came back," he whispered. "You came back." "Told you." His eyes closed again. She screamed for the physician. The next 48 hours existed in the space between life and death that physicians call critical and soldiers call the waiting room. Kedrick lay in the garrison's medical ward on the same cot where he had sat across from Serafina and promised to return. And the physician, a woman named Aldara, who had been stitching soldiers together for 20 years, worked on him with the grim, unhurried precision of someone who understood that panic was the enemy of surgery. The rib wound required 32 stitches, the forearm cut required 18. A third wound on his thigh, another one he did not remember, required 12. He had lost enough blood to fill a basin twice over, and the first night his temperature dropped so low that Aldara packed heated stones around his body and sat beside him until dawn, monitoring his pulse with her fingers on his wrist, counting the beats and the gaps between beats, and waiting for the gaps to become permanent. They did not. Serafina did not leave the medical ward. She sat in a chair beside his cot with her hand on his arm, not holding it, just resting there, maintaining contact, a physical tether between his body and the world that his consciousness had temporarily vacated. She did not sleep. She did not eat. She sat and watched his chest rise and fall and counted the breaths the way Aldara counted heartbeats, each one a small, insufficient miracle that she refused to take for granted. On the second morning, he woke. His eyes opened with the slow, confused blink of a man returning from somewhere deep and dark. And the first thing he saw was Serafina sitting beside him with bruises under her eyes and dried blood on her clothes, and the face of a woman who had spent 2 days negotiating with the universe for one more breath from the man lying in front of her. "How long?" he said. His voice was a ruin. 2 days. "The Imperials?" "Gone. The cavalry retreated to Ashenmere. Theros received a raven from Greymarch this morning. The Imperial main column surrendered in the corridor. Marin's forces took 4,000 prisoners. The Emperor's northern campaign is finished." Kedrick processed this information with the slow, careful cognition of a brain that was still rebuilding its connection to a body that had nearly died. 4,000 prisoners. The Emperor's northern army, the force that was supposed to crush Ravencroft and bring the Duke of Blackthorn to his knees, was destroyed. Not defeated. Destroyed. Scattered across a mountain corridor and a burning garrison, and the frozen spaces between, their commander dead, their supply lines severed, their strategic objective reduced to the single humiliating fact that they had been outmaneuvered by a duke with 800 soldiers, and the kind of stubborn, irrational refusal to lose that military academies could not teach because it came from somewhere textbooks did not cover. "Vivienne?" he asked. "In custody. Theros has her under guard at the corridor's northern exit. She was captured trying to reach the Imperial lines during the battle." "And Halloween?" "His cavalry officers are demanding negotiation. Without Imperial support, Halloween has no supply chain and no strategic objective. Theros expects a formal surrender within the week." Kedrick lay on the cot and stared at the ceiling and felt the information settle into the architecture of his understanding the way rain settles into soil. It was over. Not the politics. Politics were never over. There would be negotiations and treaties and the long, grinding process of rebuilding a duchy that had been torn apart from the inside. But the existential threat, the war that had started when he carried a woman from an imperial palace and ended when 31 riders crashed into a burning garrison in the dark, was over. He turned his head and looked at Serafina. "I made a mess," he said. She stared at him. Then something broke across her face, something that was not quite laughter, and not quite tears, and not quite either, but something in between, something that happened when the tension that had been holding a person together for weeks finally released and the structural integrity of composure failed in the most human way possible. "Yes," she said, "you made a mess. I started a war because I could not stand watching someone else claim you. Yes. Oh, I burned my own empire to the ground because a 14-year-old boy inside me saw your face and panicked. Yes. And then I rode a horse to death across a frozen plain because I promised you I would come back and I am apparently incapable of breaking a promise once I have been stupid enough to make one. Yes, Kaedric, all of that. Every catastrophic, irrational, self-destructive part of it. Yes. He reached for her hand. The movement cost him enough pain that his breath caught and his jaw locked and the stitches along his ribs pulled against the wound edges. But he reached, because reaching was the thing he had spent his entire life refusing to do, and the refusal had cost him more than any wound ever had. She took his hand. "I need to tell you something," he said. "You need to rest." "But I need to tell you this more than I need to rest, and I need you to hear it before I lose whatever this is that is making me capable of saying it, because I have spent 34 years building walls against exactly this kind of vulnerability, and the walls are down right now, but they will rebuild themselves if I let them, and I do not want to let them." She went quiet. Her fingers tightened around his. "I do not know how to love someone without trying to own them. That is the truth. Every instinct I have, every reflex, every pattern that was burned into me when I was 14 years old tells me that the way to keep something safe is to control it completely. Lock the gates, post the guards, build the walls so high that nothing can reach what is inside them." He paused, drew a breath that hurt. "But the walls did not protect my family, and the gates did not protect my castle. And all the control in the world did not prevent Vivian from spending 20 years smiling at me across a dinner table while the ashes of my mother settled into the foundations beneath her feet." His eyes were wet, not tears. His body was too dehydrated for tears, but the moisture that gathered along his lower lashes carried the same weight. "You told me to learn how to ask instead of command. I do not know if I can learn that. I do not know if the damage is too old and too deep and too structural to repair. But I know that the man I was before you walked into my great hall is not the man I want to be for the rest of whatever time I have left. And I know that the only thing I have ever built that was worth keeping is not a castle or a duchy or an army. It is the fact that you are sitting in this chair holding my hand, and I did not have to threaten or coerce or command you to do it. You chose to, and that choice is worth more than every wall I have ever raised." Serafina did not respond immediately. She sat in the chair beside his cot in a garrison medical ward that smelled of pine resin and blood and the sharp mineral tang of surgical salves, and she held the hand of a man who had started a war and lost a castle and killed soldiers in a mountain corridor and ridden through darkness toward fire and fallen from a horse into her arms, and she processed what he had said with the careful, unhurried attention of a woman who understood that the words a man speaks when his defenses are down are the only words worth trusting. "I did not choose you because you are powerful," she said. "I chose you because you sat in a chair outside my door all night with a sword across your knees because you did not know how to say you were afraid. I chose you because you knelt in the snow beside a dead child and stayed there when every instinct told you to keep moving. I chose you because when I told you the truth about Vivian, you listened, and listening is the hardest thing a man like you will ever do." She leaned forward and pressed her forehead against his. "I did not choose the Duke of Blackthorn. I chose the man underneath the Duke, the one who has been hiding under the floor for 20 years. I chose him, and I will keep choosing him for as long as he lets me." Kaedric closed his eyes. His forehead rested against hers. Their breathing synchronized, two rhythms finding each other in the quiet of the medical ward, settling into a pattern that neither of them consciously created, but that both of them recognized as the first stable thing either had felt in weeks. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Outside, the garrison began the slow process of rebuilding what the siege had broken. Soldiers cleared rubble from the breached walls. Engineers assessed structural damage. The wounded were treated and the dead were prepared for burial with the somber efficiency of a military operation that understood loss as a cost of business and mourning as a luxury that came after the work was done. Kaedric recovered over the following 2 weeks with the grudging cooperation of a body that wanted to rest and a mind that refused to allow it. He was on his feet within 4 days, walking the garrison corridors within 6, and standing in the war room with Theros and Marin within 8, reviewing intelligence reports and negotiation frameworks with the focused intensity of a man who was already planning the next phase of a campaign that most people believed was over. But the planning was different now. The old Kaedric would have begun calculating retribution, targets, punishments, the systematic destruction of every house, and every lord and every institution that had betrayed Ravencroft during the crisis. That was the pattern. That was the architecture. Threat, response, elimination, deterrence. The cycle that had kept him in power for 20 years and had nearly destroyed him in 3 weeks. The new Caedric, the one who was still under construction, the one whose foundations had been laid in a medical ward by a woman who chose the man underneath the Duke, sat in the war room and asked a question he had never asked before. "What do they need?" Theros looked up from the map. "Your Grace? The houses that betrayed us, Durnwood, Ashford, Pemberton, the 11 who sided with Vivian. What do they need?" "They need to be punished. Standard protocol, land seizure, title revocation, military occupation of their estates." "That is what I would have done last month. I am asking a different question. Why did they betray me?" Theros set down his pen. He looked at his duke the way a man looks at a familiar landscape after an earthquake, recognizing the shapes but noticing that the ground beneath them has shifted. "Fear," Theros said. "They feared the war you started. They feared imperial reprisal. They feared their families would be destroyed if they stayed loyal to a duke who had just declared war on the throne over a woman. And if I punish them for that fear, what do I create? More fear. And more fear creates what? More betrayal." Caedric leaned back in his chair, the stitches pulled. He ignored them. "I am not pardoning them. Pardons are weakness dressed in generosity. But I am not destroying them either, because destruction is the tool that created Vivian, and I will not build my duchy on the same foundation that built her." "Then what do you propose, Your Grace?" "Accountability, public, transparent. Every house that broke loyalty faces a tribunal, not my tribunal, a tribunal of their peers. Let the duchy itself decide the cost of betrayal, and let the duchy itself decide whether the cost is destruction or restoration. Take me out of the equation." "Your Grace, that is unprecedented. Everything I have done in the last 3 weeks has been unprecedented. I started a war over a woman. I lost my castle. I used myself as bait in a mountain corridor. I rode across a frozen plain and fell off my horse into the arms of a person who caught me badly and probably bruised my remaining unbroken ribs in the process. Unprecedented is apparently my new operating principle." Marin, who had been silent through the exchange, allowed herself a small, tight smile. "The duchy will respect it. A duke who submits his own justice to the judgment of his people is a duke who understands something most rulers never learn. And what is that? That power held too tightly breaks the hand holding it." The negotiations with the Empire took 6 weeks. Emperor Adrian, facing the political reality of a destroyed northern army, 4,000 prisoners of war whose families were demanding return, and the growing internal dissent of noble houses who had watched the most powerful duchy in the empire survive everything thrown at it, sent envoys to Ironfell with terms that would have been unthinkable 3 months earlier. Recognition of Ravencroft's sovereignty, withdrawal of all imperial claims on the duchy's territory, return of prisoners in exchange for a formal non-aggression pact, and the quiet, undocumented understanding that the Duke of Blackthorn was not a man the Empire wanted to provoke again. Caedric reviewed the terms in the war room with Theros and Seraphina beside him. He signed them without ceremony. The pen felt strange in his hand, lighter than a sword, more permanent than a blade. Swords could be deflected. Treaties endured. Lord Cedric Halloween surrendered his claim on Seraphina's hand as a condition of the peace. He did it through an envoy because he was not brave enough to deliver the concession in person, and the envoy, a nervous young man with impeccable manners and visible sweat stains, presented the formal withdrawal of engagement with the stiff formality of someone delivering bad news to a dangerous animal. Caedric accepted the document without comment. Seraphina was not present for the meeting because she had told Caedric that Halloween's surrender was a matter of political protocol and she had better things to do with her afternoon than watch paperwork. She was in the medical ward. She had been in the medical ward every afternoon for 6 weeks, working alongside Aldara, learning field medicine, treating the soldiers and civilians who were still recovering from the siege. She had no formal training. She learned by doing, by watching, by asking questions and listening to answers and putting her hands on wounds she did not know how to treat until she did. It was, Kadric thought when he watched her from the doorway, the most practical form of power he had ever witnessed. Not the power to destroy, the power to repair, and the quiet, stubborn refusal to accept that repair was someone else's responsibility. Spring came to Ravencroft the way spring comes to places that have survived winter through sheer obstinacy. Slowly, grudgingly, 1 degree at a time, as if the warmth itself was skeptical of its welcome. The black snow stopped falling, the mountain passes opened, and the refugees who had followed Caedric through the forest and the garrison and the war began making their way home to villages and estates that had been abandoned for months and now needed everything: repair, replanting, rebuilding, the 1,000 small acts of restoration that turn a war zone back into a place where people can live. Caedric sent soldiers with them, not to garrison or control or monitor, to help, to carry lumber and raise walls and dig irrigation channels alongside the farmers and tradespeople who had lost everything and were starting over with nothing except the land beneath their feet and the grudging, astonishing fact that they were alive. It was not generosity. Caedric did not think of it as generosity, and he would have rejected the word if anyone had used it in his presence. It was investment. It was the recognition that a duchy built on fear produced subjects who betrayed you the moment fear was insufficient, and a duchy built on something else, something harder to define and harder to sustain, but infinitely more durable, produced people who fought for you because they chose to. Like Marin, like Theros, like the 30 men who had ridden with him through darkness toward a burning garrison without being ordered to. Like Seraphina. They returned to Blackthorn Castle in late spring. The castle was damaged but standing. The Imperial occupiers had looted the treasury and burned the Great Hall and desecrated the war chamber, but the walls held. The towers held. The black stone that had been quarried from the mountains and laid by generations of Vales who understood that fortifications outlast the men who build them had absorbed the violence and endured. Caedric walked through the corridors of his castle and felt the old ghost stirring, his mother in the west wing, his brothers in the courtyard, the boy under the floor, 14 years old, choking on smoke, listening to the world end. But the ghost did not own him anymore. He stopped in the cathedral wing where he had once stood beside Seraphina and listened to her say that power could not save anyone. The marble statues of dead rulers still lined the walls, their stone faces turned upward toward a ceiling blackened by the fire the Imperials had set. Names carved in stone, dates of reign. The compressed biographies of men who had held this duchy and believed, each one of them, that their walls would hold forever. They were wrong, every one of them. The walls never held forever. Nothing held forever. That was the lesson the boy under the floor had learned at 14 and spent 20 years trying to disprove, building higher and thicker and more brutal, until the walls themselves became a kind of prison, and the man inside them became indistinguishable from the stone. But the boy was out from under the floor now, standing upright, breathing clean air, looking at the statues of his ancestors not with the desperate need to surpass them, but with the calm, clear-eyed recognition that their legacy was not the walls they built, but the choices they made about what to protect inside them. Seraphina found him there. She always found him there. It had become the place where they went when the noise of governance and reconstruction and the daily machinery of running a duchy grew too loud, the one room in the castle where the silence was deep enough to think in. She stood beside him and looked at the statues. "You are going to rebuild the Great Hall," she said. "Yes." "And the war chamber." "Yes." "And the treasury." "Eventually." "And what about you?" He looked at her. The spring light coming through the damaged windows caught the edges of her face, the jaw, the cheekbones, the dark eyes that had looked at him without fear in a room full of wolves and changed the trajectory of his entire existence. "I am under construction," he said. "Permanently, I think." "Good. Finished men are boring." "I was never boring." "No. Terrifying, brutal, emotionally impaired, and profoundly difficult, but never boring." He almost smiled. The expression still felt unfamiliar on his face, a movement his muscles performed with the awkward effort of someone relearning a skill they had abandoned in childhood. But it came more easily now than it had in the forest or the garrison or the medical ward. Practice. Even smiling responded to practice. "I told you once that I was going to ask you something," he said. "After the war, after the rebuilding, after I figured out the words. I remember. I still have not figured out the words." "Then stop trying to figure them out and just say them." He turned to face her fully. The light and the silence and the stone faces of the dead surrounded them, and Cadric Vale, Duke of Blackthorn, survivor of fire and betrayal and war, and the long, brutal process of learning that strength without vulnerability was just a more sophisticated form of weakness, looked at the woman who had taught him the difference and said the only words he had. "Stay." Not a command, not a demand, not the voice of a duke who expected obedience because obedience was the only language he had ever spoken. A request. The first genuine request he had ever made. One word, stripped of authority and armor and the 20 years of fortification that had made him untouchable and unreachable and desperately, catastrophically alone. Stay. Serafina looked at him for a long time, long enough for the light to shift through the damaged windows, long enough for the silence to become a third presence in the room, a witness to the moment when a man who had built his life on control finally surrendered the one thing he had never been willing to release. The outcome. "I already stayed," she said. "I stayed when you locked me in this castle. I stayed when you started a war. I stayed when the walls fell and the army came and the world you built collapsed around both of us. I have been staying, Cadric, every single day since I walked into your hall and you looked at me like I was either a threat or a miracle and could not decide which. I still cannot decide. Good. Keep not deciding. It is the most honest thing about you." She stepped forward and placed her hand on his chest, over the scar tissue and the stitches and the heartbeat that had nearly stopped in a garrison courtyard 3 months ago, and she felt it beating under her palm, steady and strong and alive. "I will stay," she said. "Not because you asked, because I choose to, every day." That is the difference between possession and partnership, and it is the lesson you are going to spend the rest of your life learning, and I am going to be here to make sure you do not forget it. He put his hand over hers, pressed it against his chest, felt his own heartbeat through her fingers and hers through his, two rhythms that were not the same but that occupied the same space, and found, in that shared space, something that neither rhythm could produce alone. "I will get it wrong," he said. "The asking, the not commanding. I will get it wrong more often than I get it right. I know. And you will stay anyway. I will stay anyway. And I will tell you when you are getting it wrong, loudly, in front of people, because that is what you need, not someone who bows, someone who stands beside you and tells you the truth, even when the truth makes you want to throw furniture." "I do not throw furniture. You threw a chair through a window during the Ashenmere negotiations last week. That was a diplomatic statement. That was a tantrum. It was an aggressive diplomatic statement." She laughed. The sound echoed off the stone walls of the cathedral wing and bounced between the statues of dead rulers who had never heard laughter in this room, because this room was built for solemnity and gravity and the performance of power, and the laughter did not belong here, and that was exactly why it mattered. Because laughter in a room built for power was a form of revolution. And revolutions, Cadric was learning, did not always require armies. Months passed. The duchy rebuilt. The great hall rose from its ashes with new stone laid alongside old, the seams visible, the damage not hidden but incorporated, because Serafina had insisted that a castle should wear its scars the same way a person should, openly, as evidence of what it had survived, rather than what it wished it had not endured. Trade routes reopened through the mountain passes. Villages that had been abandoned during the war filled again with families returning to farms that needed plowing and shops that needed stocking and lives that needed the ordinary, unglamorous work of continuation. The corrupt ministers who had laughed at Serafina during her first council appearance were replaced by administrators she selected personally, men and women who understood that the purpose of governance was not to serve the governor, but to serve the governed, and who feared the new Duchess of Ravencroft's displeasure more than they had ever feared the Duke's blade, because the blade was quick and Serafina's disappointment was eternal. The people of Ravencroft learned the new order quickly. Her compassion was genuine, unyielding, extended to every person in the duchy from the highest lord to the lowest laborer without exception or qualification. Her anger, when it came, was the anger of a woman who had inherited something from the man she loved, something sharp and precise and absolutely unwilling to tolerate the mistreatment of people who could not defend themselves. They made, the court whispered, a terrifying combination. One evening, as autumn began turning the northern forest from green to gold, and the first cold winds of the approaching winter swept down from the mountains, Kedrick stood on the highest balcony of Blackthorn Castle, the same balcony where the story began. Below, the courtyard was filled not with prisoners in chains, but with merchants unloading goods and children playing between the market stalls that Serafina had established in the space where executions once took place. Torchlight flickered against the black stone walls. Laughter rose from the great hall where a feast was being prepared, not for terrified nobles seeking favor, but for the garrison soldiers returning from the border, and the villagers who had brought the harvest in, and the ordinary, imperfect, stubbornly alive people who made Ravencroft worth defending. Serafina stepped onto the balcony beside him. She wore dark blue, the same color she had worn at the Imperial Ascension Ball, the night he had destroyed everything and started everything and become, through violence and stupidity and the one act of irrational courage that his entire life had been building toward, the man standing on this balcony, watching children play where prisoners once bled. "You are standing in the same spot," she said. "I know. Are you seeing the same thing?" He looked at the courtyard below, at the market stalls and the children and the merchants and the soldiers and the life that had grown in the spaces where his control had once been absolute and his isolation had been complete. "No," he said. "I am seeing something I did not build. You built it. I built the walls. You built what is inside them." She rested her hand against his chest where his heart beat beneath black military silk, the same gesture she had made in the medical ward, the same contact point that had become the geography of their connection, the place where his body met her hand and the boundary between two separate people dissolved into something shared. "A man once told me that power was the only reason names survived," she said. "He was wrong. What makes names survive?" He covered her hand with his, felt the pulse beneath his ribs, the steady rhythm that had nearly stopped in a garrison courtyard and had been rebuilt, beat by beat, in the hands of a woman who refused to let it end. "The choice to be worth remembering," he said. The wind came down from the mountains and swept across the balcony and carried with it the sound of laughter from the hall below, and the smell of cooking fires and the cold, clean scent of a season turning toward winter. And Cedric Vale, Duke of Blackthorn, the man who had terrified kings and burned empires and survived fire and betrayal and war and the long, agonizing education of learning that the strongest thing a man can do is not hold on but let go, stood with the woman who had taught him the difference and watched the kingdom. He had rebuilt, not with blood, but with the slow, painful, revolutionary act of trust, and understood finally the one truth that the boy under the floor had been searching for since the night the world burned. A kingdom taken by force could always be taken back, but a kingdom earned by the people inside it became something that force could never touch. Not immortal. Nothing was immortal. Not permanent. Nothing was permanent, but real. Lived in. Fought for. Built not on the foundation of one man's control, but on the accumulated choices of every person who decided, freely and without coercion, that this place and these walls and this scarred, difficult, perpetually under construction Duke were worth defending. He lowered his forehead against hers. The conqueror who had terrified empires closed his eyes, and the boy under the floor, after 20 years of silence, finally rested.